Every monster begins as someone ordinary, a man chasing control, a woman chasing influence, and a country, broken, desperate, willing to believe in legends. In the summer of 1933, as America gasped through the Great Depression, one oil man vanished into the dark. His only clues were sound, the beat of rain on tin, the passing of airplanes overhead, the creak of a well in the wind. From those fragments, the FBI built a map that would change law enforcement forever. At its center stood a couple who mistook fear for fame: George "Machine Gun" Kelly, America's outlaw myth, and Catherine Kelly, the quiet mind behind the mask. Together, they turned a kidnapping into a national reckoning. It began with a bridge game in Oklahoma City. It ended with the birth of the modern FBI. Between those 2 points lies a question that still lingers in every mind drawn to power: what happens when control becomes the only thing you worship? The story began in the uneasy calm of post-Prohibition America, when the country was split between the defiance of gangsters and the tightening grip of federal law enforcement. In the small towns of Tennessee and Texas, a man named George Kelly Barnes was drifting through the ruins of his own ambitions. He had been many things in his life: a salesman, a farmhand, a bootleg runner, a convict, but nothing that gave him permanence. Each failed venture left him farther from respectability and deeper in the world of outlaw trade that thrived in the shadows of the 1920s. The end of the decade found him restless, living under borrowed names and looking for one more chance to climb above obscurity. Born in 1897 in Memphis, Kelly came from a modest family and a conventional education. He was bright, personable, and easily led astray. After short stints in college and odd jobs, he turned to bootlegging. During the years when the country's thirst for illegal liquor created an underworld economy of fast money and faster violence, he ran small shipments across state lines, evading local deputies and earning the kind of reputation that traveled in whispers. What little money he made dissolved quickly in bars and cheap hotels. Arrest followed arrest. By his mid-20s, he had already spent time in jail and carried the unease of a man who had squandered every straight path life had offered him. When Prohibition tightened and organized crime began consolidating control over alcohol routes, Kelly found himself outmatched. Larger syndicates demanded discipline, alliances, and tribute, things a solitary smuggler could not afford. He fled south and west, changing addresses as easily as aliases, always a few steps ahead of creditors and lawmen. In 1927, in Fort Worth, Texas, his life collided with that of a woman whose ambition outstripped his own. Catherine Thorne was the daughter of a restless family, raised around bootleggers and small-time hustlers. By the time she met Kelly, she had already been married and widowed under suspicious circumstances. Her husband, Charlie Thorne, had been found dead, ruled a suicide, though no one close to the case believed it entirely. Catherine was striking, sharp, and manipulative. With an instinct for power, she recognized in Kelly not just a criminal, but a man she could mold. He was pliable, experienced enough to know danger, but uncertain enough to be steered toward greater risks. Within months they were inseparable. When she married him, she did not take his name so much as reforge it. Through Catherine's connections, Kelly entered a wider circuit of crime. The couple moved between Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico, operating out of safe houses, speakeasies, and roadside hideouts. They trafficked whiskey, ran errands for local syndicates, and learned to mask their movements through bribes and coded telegraphs. Catherine's influence grew quickly. She was bold where he was cautious, calculating where he was careless. Together, they began buying expensive clothes, fine cars and jewelry, luxuries that projected importance even when the money behind them was unstable. They frequented nightclubs in Dallas and Tulsa, introducing themselves as entrepreneurs, spinning stories about oil and livestock investments. Few asked questions, most knew better. By 1928, Kelly's minor offenses caught up with him. He was arrested in New Mexico on a liquor running charge and sentenced to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. Inside, he adopted the quiet discipline of survival. Leavenworth in the late 1920s was filled with Prohibition offenders, bank robbers, and killers. The corridors buzzed with whispered alliances. Kelly listened and learned. He observed how men communicated through codes hidden in letters, and how contraband moved under the eyes of guards. When he was released, he was leaner, more deliberate, and far less afraid of the system that had caged him. Prison hardened his composure, without extinguishing his charm, and Catherine waited outside the walls with renewed plans. The Thorne-Kelly union now became a business partnership. Catherine had seen how fame clung to outlaws, like Jesse James and Al Capone. The newspapers gave them the aura of kings, and she wanted the same for her husband. She began referring to him as Machine Gun Kelly, though he did not yet own such a weapon. The name, spread through taverns and gossip, gave him credibility among criminals who valued reputation as much as skill. Catherine even arranged for him to pose with a Thompson submachine gun for photographs that she distributed among their acquaintances. The image, a smiling man holding the symbol of modern gangster warfare, was enough to make him infamous before he had committed a single act worthy of it. Between 1929 and 1931, the Kellys slipped deeper into organized crime. The collapse of the stock market turned desperate men into thieves, and the Midwest into an open hunting ground for bank robbers. Machine guns, fast cars, and police corruption created an era where mobility was everything. The Kellys joined crews that specialized in quick robberies, striking small banks in Kansas, Texas, and Mississippi. They operated with varying success, earning just enough to maintain their appearance of wealth. Witnesses described a polite gunman, often well-dressed, whose weapon was more theatrical than necessary. Kelly liked control, not chaos. His heists were rarely violent, but each deepened the myth of his menace. Catherine's role was central. She laundered money through jewelry stores, and used her mother, Ora Shannon, as a front for property transactions that masked their movement. Her mother's ranch near Paradise, Texas, became a hub for associates moving stolen goods and illegal alcohol. The isolation of rural Wise County, surrounded by dirt roads and farmland, provided a perfect refuge. Catherine's control extended beyond logistics. She shaped Kelly's identity. She reminded associates of his so-called prowess, with the Thompson, repeating stories that blurred fact and legend. The criminal underworld began to see Machine Gun Kelly as a figure to be feared, and George, unable to resist the attention, grew into the performance. The law, meanwhile, was changing. The Bureau of Investigation, later to become the FBI, was evolving from a loosely coordinated agency into a disciplined national force. Under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, agents began standardizing fingerprints, compiling criminal records, and enforcing new federal statutes. The Lindbergh kidnapping in 1932 had shocked the nation and led to the passage of the Federal Kidnapping Act, granting federal jurisdiction over abductions that crossed state lines. For men like Kelly, who had once exploited state boundaries as shields, the new law meant the end of safe havens. The government's reach was expanding, and the old bootleggers were being hunted on a national scale. Kelly's reputation continued to inflate through exaggeration. Reporters, hungry for stories of glamorous criminals, amplified every rumor. His nickname appeared in papers alongside accounts of robberies he had never committed. Some stories claimed he had escaped police shootouts with ease. Others described him leading armed gangs across state lines. The myths made him valuable to those who needed a name that inspired fear. Smaller gangs began claiming association with him to bolster their own stature. For the first time, George Kelly Barnes realized that reputation could be a weapon as powerful as the gun his wife had handed him. Despite the legend, the Kellys' life was unstable. Their wealth came in bursts. Lavish one month, desperate the next. They moved constantly, renting furnished houses under aliases, staying ahead of both law enforcement and betrayed partners. Catherine's taste for extravagance exceeded their means, and each new acquisition required another robbery. Kelly's confidence wavered. He was not a natural killer. Violence repelled him, even as he used its threat to survive. Yet his wife's ambition left little room for restraint. To her, his hesitation was weakness, and weakness was unforgivable. The marriage hardened into a cycle of schemes and reconciliations, each more dangerous than the last. By 1931, Kelly was deeply entangled with other known criminals, including Albert L. Bates, a seasoned bank robber, whose experience far surpassed his own. Bates introduced him to a broader network that included Harvey Bailey, one of the most notorious gangsters of the era. These men lived by the code of professional criminals, dispassionate, transactional, and bound by mutual survival. Kelly's association with them lifted him into the upper tier of outlaws, but it also tethered him to their eventual downfall. The FBI's expanding intelligence files began recording his name alongside theirs, building a dossier that would later serve as the blueprint for his capture. The end of Prohibition in 1933 loomed over them like a storm. With the repeal of the Volstead Act, bootlegging profits would vanish, forcing thousands of criminals to seek new rackets. Some turned to gambling, others to bank robbery or extortion. Catherine looked instead to kidnapping, a crime that under the new Lindbergh law carried heavy federal penalties but promised enormous rewards. The recent abduction of oilmen and bankers had yielded ransoms in the hundreds of thousands. To her, it was an opportunity perfectly suited to their skills: intimidation, mobility, and reputation. The nickname she had invented would now serve as a weapon in negotiation. A man feared as Machine Gun Kelly could demand anything. Throughout 1932, the couple lived under a veil of unease. They drifted between Fort Worth, Dallas, and Shreveport, each stop shorter than the last. The law closed in around their associates. Bates was wanted for multiple robberies. Bailey was under surveillance, and the underworld was fracturing. Newspapers still printed Kelly's name, but the stories had turned from fascination to contempt. Hoover's bureau had begun a campaign to dismantle the romantic image of gangsters, portraying them as cowards rather than folk heroes. In public bulletins, the government emphasized the cost of their violence and the suffering of victims. The cultural tide was shifting. The era of celebrity criminals was nearing its end. Kelly himself aged quickly under the pressure. His once clean demeanor grew haggard, His nerves eroded by the constant flight from justice. He drank heavily and relied on Catherine's control to maintain the illusion of command. Yet beneath the surface, fear crept in. Every knock on a motel door carried the weight of a possible raid. Every letter risked interception. He began to distrust allies, burning notes after reading them, refusing to stay in one place for more than a week. The contradiction of his life, fame without security, power without peace, deepened the instability that would soon destroy him. Catherine, however, remained relentless. She managed their correspondence, kept ledgers of contacts, and coordinated with her mother and stepfamily near Paradise, Texas. The Shannon Ranch, remote and shielded by cornfields, offered the perfect staging ground for future operations. Its well water, barnyard animals, and isolation would later etch themselves into history through the testimony of a kidnapped man. For now, it was merely a safe house, one of several scattered across Texas and Oklahoma. The Kellys visited frequently, always planning, always moving cash and weapons through the property. The Thompson submachine gun, once a mere prop in a photograph, became a regular fixture in their possession. Catherine insisted that George learn to handle it properly, firing at makeshift targets in the countryside. He practiced methodically, adjusting his stance, studying the recoil, treating the weapon less as a tool of war and more as a symbol of legitimacy. The sound of its discharge echoed across the empty fields, a declaration that their transformation was complete. Whatever remained of George Barnes, the bootlegger, had been replaced by the legend his wife had invented. As 1932 gave way to 1933, the Kellys stood at the edge of their own myth. The country was reeling from the Great Depression. Unemployment and hunger had made violence commonplace. Across the Midwest, gangs roamed highways in stolen cars, robbing banks that had already collapsed under financial strain. Public sympathy, once extended to daring outlaws, began to fade. The new federal agents, armed with authority and precision, were winning ground. The Kellys sensed that their window was closing. To secure the life they imagined, one of wealth, notoriety, and permanence, they needed a single decisive act that would eclipse their petty crimes. In the rented rooms where they stayed, Catherine outlined plans that mixed logic with desperation. The targets were always men of means: oil executives, bankers, and industrialists. Each plan revolved around ransom, money that could be obtained quickly, laundered easily, and spent freely. Kelly listened, uneasy, but compliant. His instincts told him that kidnapping brought too much attention. Yet his pride, bound to the persona of Machine Gun Kelly, refused retreat. Every newspaper that repeated his name made withdrawal impossible. He had become a prisoner of his own invention, driven to live up to a legend that had no exit. By the winter of 1932, they had tested smaller operations, shakedowns, and threats that never materialized into full abductions. The results emboldened Catherine, who viewed hesitation as failure. Her influence dominated their partnership completely. She was the strategist. He was the instrument. Their circle tightened around a handful of trusted criminals, including Bates, who shared their appetite for high-stakes ventures. The plan that would define their fate began to take shape, not in grandeur, but in routine conversations about opportunity. The target would be someone with wealth, visibility, and the means to pay quickly. A man like Charles Urschel. The months leading to the kidnapping were filled with quiet motion. They scouted locations, studied backroads, and rotated between vehicles registered under false names. Catherine maintained appearances of affluence in Fort Worth's social circles, keeping them close enough to high society to gather gossip yet distant enough to avoid scrutiny. Kelly kept to the background, avoiding public attention while his reputation continued to grow through rumor. The myth now lived its own life in the press. The man beneath it was already fading. By the spring of 1933, the transformation was complete. George Kelly Barnes no longer existed as an individual identity. What remained was a symbol, a gangster molded by myth, sustained by fear, and driven by the ambitions of the woman beside him. The machine gun that had once been a prop was now the anchor of his image. It hung beside his bed, gleaming under lamplight, a reminder that he was both protected and condemned by it. Catherine had succeeded in creating the legend she desired, but in doing so, she had set the course for their destruction. The world around them had changed. The Bureau of Investigation was preparing to federalize kidnapping enforcement, arming itself with new agents and broader authority. The very crime the Kellys were about to commit would become the test case for the Bureau's emerging power. In the coming months, their names would move from whispered circles to national headlines, and the myth of Machine Gun Kelly would collide with the cold machinery of federal justice. But for now, in the dim light of rented rooms and remote farms, they believed themselves untouchable. The name carried weight, the gun promised safety, and the plan ahead seemed foolproof. They could not yet see the inevitability of the path they had chosen, the precise chain of events that would transform a self-made legend into a cautionary monument of American crime. The night before their first reconnaissance trip for the Urschel abduction, the fields outside Paradise were silent. Except for the distant hum of oil pumps, somewhere beyond the darkness, a future victim sat unaware in his Oklahoma home, playing bridge on a quiet summer evening. The prologue ends there, with the illusion of control intact, and the machine gun gleaming in the light of a farmhouse window, a symbol of a man who had built his reputation from nothing, and would soon lose everything to the myth that bore his name. The evening of July 22nd, 1933, settled over Oklahoma City, with the kind of heavy warmth that hung in the air like a warning. The sun had dropped behind the tree line, and the last of its color leaked across the horizon, in a dull orange haze. On the edge of Nichols Hills, a quiet neighborhood, removed from the noise of downtown, the house of Charles Urschel stood trimmed and orderly. Its screened porch, lit by the soft glow of an electric lamp. Inside, the day's heat had thinned into a manageable stillness. The sound of cards shuffling and soft conversation filled the porch, where 4 people sat at a table: the Urschels and their friends, Walter R. Jarrett and his wife. The house was built for comfort, a 2-story home of brick and wood, surrounded by trimmed hedges and an expanse of open yard. Beyond the property, a narrow road led toward the city, the fields quiet, except for the rhythmic hum of insects. It was the sort of place that gave a man the illusion of safety. For Urschel, one of the wealthiest oilmen in Oklahoma, the illusion had lasted for years. His wealth had survived bank failures and market crashes. His name carried influence in boardrooms and churches alike. The depression which had crushed so many others had left his family secure. That night he was at ease, the air heavy but pleasant, a drink near his hand, the porch screens keeping the mosquitoes at bay. Somewhere beyond the hedges, a car idled in the dark. The sound was faint, almost indistinguishable from the cicadas, but steady, a mechanical pulse that did not belong to the neighborhood. The road in front of the house was little traveled after dusk. Whoever waited there had planned it that way. About 11:15 p.m., the quiet fractured. The porch door opened with a sudden metallic snap of hinges. 2 men stepped through the screen, their shadows cutting across the lamplight. One carried a Thompson submachine gun, the other a .45 caliber pistol. They moved with the precision of men who had rehearsed the sequence in their minds a dozen times. The game on the table froze in place, cards half raised, eyes turning toward the intruders. The shorter of the 2 covered the group with the machine gun, the other demanded identification. Scanning the faces before him, uncertain which man was his target. When no one answered, he gestured sharply, forcing both men to their feet. The women were ordered to stay where they were, warned in low, sharp tones not to move or call out. The gunman with the Thompson positioned himself between them and the street, ensuring that anyone who ran would face a wall of bullets. The abduction took less than a minute. The 2 victims were marched through the porch door and down the walkway toward the gate. From the living room, a servant heard the commotion and froze beside the stairway, recognizing danger too late to intervene. The machine gun caught the porch light and reflected it in dull flashes as the men pushed their captives toward a waiting Chevrolet sedan parked under the trees. The night swallowed the sound of the car doors closing. A few seconds later, the engine roared, and the vehicle accelerated down the road, tires spitting gravel, its rear lights fading toward the darkness beyond Nichols Hills. Inside the house, Mrs. Urschel stood motionless for several seconds, registering the sudden emptiness where her husband had been. The silence after the car's departure felt unnatural, broken only by the faint echo of the engine retreating toward the highway. She turned back to the table, the cards still scattered, the lamp trembling slightly from the movement of the door. Then she moved, quickly, efficiently, toward the telephone. Across the city, the streets were nearly deserted. Prohibition's end was still months away, and most establishments had long since closed for the night. Patrol cars drifted through the downtown district, their officers unaware that a kidnapping was unfolding in one of the city's most affluent neighborhoods. The Chevrolet sedan, carrying its 2 abductors and captives, had already reached the edge of town. The headlights were off. The driver followed a route planned in advance, west to a dirt road parallel to the 23rd Street highway, then northeast toward open country. The vehicle moved fast, its tires cutting through dust, the suspension rattling on uneven ground. In the back seat, the 2 men kept their prisoners silent with the cold precision of professionals. The submachine gun lay across one lap, ready but unused. Within minutes, the car passed the last clusters of city lights and entered farmland. Faint moonlight revealed fences, telephone poles, and the occasional silhouette of an oil derrick in the distance. The kidnappers knew the terrain well. Each turn was measured, each intersection anticipated. Their goal was distance, 12 miles from the city, enough to obscure direction before changing cars. Back at the Urschel residence, the call reached Washington, D.C. before midnight. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the Bureau of Investigation, was notified within minutes. The Bureau's standing order since the Lindbergh case was clear: every kidnapping of national significance demanded immediate attention. Agents in the Oklahoma City field office were awakened and instructed to secure the scene. document all physical evidence, and maintain communication with Washington. The official response was already in motion, but the night would pass before the first agents arrived. At the house, Mrs. Urschel maintained composure, despite the shock. She gathered details as she remembered them. The timing, the car's direction, the appearance of the men. Every minute counted. Neighbors began arriving, drawn by the sound of the departing car and the agitation at the house. Word spread quickly through the small, close-knit community that a kidnapping had taken place. The car meanwhile reached a narrow bridge over a shallow creek outside the city. Here the driver slowed, scanning both sides of the road for headlights. None appeared. The second man removed a length of cloth, strips of adhesive tape, and a small bottle of cotton from his pocket. One of the captives, later identified as Jarrett, was questioned briefly, then separated. The kidnappers took his wallet, removed $50, and pushed him from the car near the bridge. The vehicle then accelerated south, leaving him alone in the dust. He stumbled toward the road, disoriented, while the car vanished into the darkness. In the back seat, Charles F. Urschel sat blindfolded, his wrists bound. The tape over his ears dulled the sound of the engine, leaving him in a cocoon of muffled vibrations and shifting shadows. He focused on what details he could sense: the turns, the changes in road texture, the smell of oil fields drifting through open windows. His mind, disciplined by years of business precision, began cataloging everything. The sequence of movements, the temperature, even the pattern of the driver's gear shifts. It was instinctive, the act of turning fear into information. Hours passed as the car traversed rural Oklahoma. The kidnappers avoided main roads, choosing back routes that twisted through farmland and oil leases. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, the car stopped. Urschel was let out, his shoes crunching over gravel and dry grass. The air smelled faintly of gasoline. A distant engine idled while one of the men fetched fuel. 15 minutes later, they resumed the journey, crossing 2 gates in quick succession, before entering a structure that echoed like a garage. The sound of metal against metal suggested they were changing license plates. A larger car waited inside, a 7-passenger sedan. Urschel was guided to the back, where a makeshift bunk had been prepared. While these movements unfolded miles away, the city slept. Police dispatchers logged the initial call from the Urschel home and issued an alert to patrol cars. But without clear suspect descriptions, there was little to act on. The Bureau's agents in Washington began gathering background on potential motives. Oil men had been targeted before. In recent months, several wealthy figures across the Midwest had been threatened or abducted for ransom. Patterns were emerging: professional kidnappings, executed with military precision, suggesting experienced criminals rather than desperate opportunists. At the Urschel residence, the evidence team arrived shortly before dawn. They documented tire impressions in the driveway, fingerprints on the porch door, and the precise arrangement of objects on the card table. Every item told part of a story: a half-played bridge hand, a glass of melted ice, a chair pushed slightly askew. The investigation would later reveal that the 2 kidnappers had entered calmly, not recklessly. A controlled incursion executed in under 60 seconds. The night still held its grip on the countryside as the kidnappers' convoy moved deeper into the plains. The sky had clouded, and a faint breeze carried the smell of rain. Urschel lay motionless, conserving energy, memorizing the rhythm of the journey. He counted turns, estimated distances, and noted each stop. The car's tires shifted from gravel to dirt, then to planked wood that creaked beneath its weight, likely a bridge or causeway. These details, stored silently in his mind, would later become the foundation of one of the FBI's earliest and most successful geographic reconstructions. Far behind them, in the city, the porch where the crime had begun remained frozen in its disarray. Photographers documented the scene from every angle. Detectives interviewed Mrs. Urschel, noting her composure and precision. The names of potential suspects began to circulate: bootleggers, disgruntled employees, former associates from the oil business. None yet realized that the operation had been conceived hundreds of miles away by a man who had built his life on myth and intimidation. By midnight, the Chevrolet had covered nearly 40 miles. The terrain grew rougher, the road narrower. The kidnappers knew the region's geography intimately, an expanse of oil leases and abandoned farms where law enforcement presence was minimal. The plan was to reach a secure hideout by dawn. One of the men checked his watch repeatedly. Timing was critical. The less exposure before sunrise, the better their chances of avoiding detection. Back at the Urschel home, telephone lines carried the first coded messages between Oklahoma City and Washington. The Bureau's command structure mobilized field offices across the region. Agents in Fort Worth, Dallas, and Tulsa received orders to stand by. The chain of communication moved through secure teletypes, each transmission stamped with Hoover's initials. The case was now federal. In the country, the kidnappers reached their destination, a rural property surrounded by fields and outbuildings. They drove the car into a wooden structure that smelled of hay and oil. The engine cut, leaving only the chirp of insects outside. One man opened a door, guiding Urschel out. His shoes touched a boardwalk. The air was thick with humidity. A few steps later he was led into a house, up a short set of stairs, and into a room with an iron cot. There were voices in another room. A man and a woman, indistinct through the cotton stuffed in his ears. Then the sound of a bolt sliding into place. The night of July 22nd ended with silence on both fronts. The victim imprisoned in an unknown farmhouse. And the city of Oklahoma, unaware that one of its most prominent citizens had vanished into the backroads. The clock had already begun counting the hours that would transform the crime into one of the defining cases of the Bureau's early history. For the kidnappers, the plan was progressing exactly as intended. They had struck swiftly, avoided resistance, and vanished without pursuit. The ransom phase would come next. For the Bureau, whose agents had not yet reached full jurisdictional power, the abduction marked a challenge unlike any before. The convergence of timing, method, and precision made clear that this was not the work of amateurs. In Washington, Hoover's aides compiled the first internal bulletin, classifying the case as a probable interstate kidnapping, under the Lindbergh Act. Even as the nation slept, the wheels of federal investigation were already turning toward the men who had carried out the abduction, and toward the couple whose ambitions had set the plan in motion. The porch lamp at the Urschel residence burned until dawn, casting light over the empty chairs and the scattered deck of cards that marked the last ordinary moment before the Bureau's most significant early pursuit began. Dawn came slowly over Oklahoma City, a muted gray light, creeping across the skyline, and filtering through a haze of summer humidity. On the outskirts of Nichols Hills, the Urschel residence sat under a blanket of unease. The porch lamp still burned from the night before, its glow paling against the early sun. The half-played bridge hand remained on the table, cards curled slightly from the damp air, as if waiting for the players to return. The silence that followed the previous night's violence was now filled with the movement of men in suits and uniforms, their shoes scuffing the walkway, their voices low but constant. Inside, the house had become a command post. Local police were the first to arrive. Officers in uniform, their notebooks open, cameras flashing in the dim light of the porch. Shortly afterward, agents from the Bureau of Investigation entered. Men dispatched from the Oklahoma City field office, under orders from Washington. The Bureau's telegrams had reached the city in the early hours of the morning, bearing Hoover's directive: secure the scene, protect the witnesses, and prepare a full preliminary report for the director himself. At the center of it all was Mrs. Charles F. Urschel, composed but visibly strained, seated near the telephone. Her recollection of the night was precise. She detailed the time, the lighting, the sequence of movement, the sound of the screen door opening, the machine gun glinting under the porch light, the direction in which the car had turned after leaving the property. Her clarity impressed the agents, though they noted the shock underneath her calm. She had made the call that mobilized the Bureau. Within minutes of her husband's abduction, she had contacted Washington directly, bypassing local intermediaries, invoking the authority of the federal government. Elsewhere in the city, Walter R. Jarrett, the second man taken that night, was making his way back towards civilization. Released hours earlier on a dirt road outside town, he had walked through fields until he reached a farmhouse, from which he managed to summon help. Exhausted, bruised, and covered in dust, he returned home shortly after 1 a.m. By morning he was sitting before investigators, providing the first detailed description of the kidnapping. Jarrett's account established the timeline. The kidnappers had driven north out of Oklahoma City, then turned east along a dirt road parallel to the 23rd Street Highway. After roughly 12 miles, they stopped at a bridge, identified him as the wrong man, and released him with a warning. They took $50 from his wallet and disappeared south. His testimony confirmed what Mrs. Urschel had reported. Two armed men, one with a submachine gun, the other with a pistol. Their movements efficient, their words calculated, their composure absolute. There had been no panic, no hesitation. The Bureau's agents recorded every word. The distinction between amateurs and professionals was already clear. Whoever orchestrated the abduction had studied their target, rehearsed their entry, and executed the operation with clockwork precision. The detail that the kidnappers had initially been uncertain which man was Urschel suggested a plan built on observation from afar, rather than direct acquaintance, surveillance without personal contact. By mid-morning, the Urschel residence was cordoned off. Fingerprint technicians from the Bureau worked methodically through the property, dusting doorknobs, tablet tops, and the edges of the porch door. Photographers captured the scene from multiple angles. Investigators measured the tire tracks left on the gravel driveway, noting the width and tread pattern for later comparison. Every cigarette butt, footprint, and fiber was cataloged. The Bureau's crime scene discipline, an innovation still new to local law enforcement, was on full display. News of the kidnapping spread quickly through Oklahoma City. Reporters gathered at the edge of the property, held back by uniformed officers. Headlines were being written before noon. The abduction of an oil magnate during the height of the Depression was sensational. It carried both fear and fascination. For the public, kidnappings had become the crime of the era, a grim byproduct of economic collapse and organized desperation. The Lindbergh case the year before had given such crimes national attention, and the public now expected the federal government to intervene. The Bureau's presence at the Urschel home reassured some, but the air of dread persisted. In Washington, Edgar Hoover was already awake, reading the first telegrams from Oklahoma City. The Bureau's headquarters, on Pennsylvania Avenue, operated with military precision, even on weekends. By 8 a.m., the director had summoned his assistant directors and section chiefs. He dictated responses personally, instructing agents across multiple field offices to prepare for interstate pursuit. Under the newly enacted Federal Kidnapping Act, jurisdiction was conditional. The Bureau could intervene only if the victim was believed to have been transported across state lines. Hoover, anticipating that this would soon be the case, ordered preliminary coordination with federal prosecutors to ensure the Bureau could proceed without delay once confirmation arrived. Back in Oklahoma, the investigation expanded beyond the Urschel home. Agents fanned out across the city, interviewing neighbors and domestic staff. One servant had glimpsed the car under the trees, a dark-colored Chevrolet sedan, older model, with no visible license plate illumination. Another recalled hearing a second vehicle earlier in the evening, possibly acting as a lookout. Patrolmen searched the surrounding roads, checking ditches and fields for discarded evidence, but found nothing of significance. The kidnappers had vanished completely. Meanwhile, the Bureau's laboratory in Washington began analyzing the first items shipped from the scene. Fingerprint samples were transmitted via telegraph code, and local prints were cross-referenced against the Bureau's growing national database. The system, still in its infancy, was one of Hoover's proudest accomplishments. A centralized repository of over 1 million fingerprint cards compiled from federal, state, and local agencies. Each set of ridges and loops was categorized by classification numbers, enabling rapid searches that were revolutionizing criminal investigations. The Urschel case would soon test that system at full capacity. As the day wore on, agents began mapping possible routes the kidnappers could have taken. Based on Jarrett's testimony and the duration of the drive before his release, the men likely traveled northeast toward unpaved farm roads leading into rural Oklahoma. From there, they could have turned south or east, crossing into Texas within a few hours. The Bureau's cartographers plotted concentric zones of probability on large paper maps, marking potential refueling stations and bridges. Every oil lease, farmhouse, and dirt road within 50 miles of Oklahoma City was now a potential clue. At noon, Hoover received a direct update from the field. The agents on site reported that the crime appeared executed with unusual deliberation and absence of panic. This language, chosen carefully, signaled to Washington that the perpetrators were organized criminals rather than common opportunists. It also meant that the likelihood of ransom demands was high. Hoover instructed his subordinates to prepare for prolonged negotiations. The Bureau's primary objective, as always in kidnapping cases, would be the safe recovery of the victim. Apprehension of the culprits would follow only after Urschel's release. At the same time, within the Bureau's identification division, clerks began reviewing files on known kidnappers and gangsters operating in the region. The names of George Machine Gun Kelly, Albert L. Bates, and Harvey J. Bailey surfaced almost immediately. Each was a veteran of the Prohibition underworld, familiar with the kind of coordinated violence seen in the Urschel case. Reports linked Kelly and Bates to Texas, where several recent robberies had exhibited similar planning. For now, these were only background references. No evidence yet connected them directly to the crime. In the afternoon, the first organized search parties departed from Oklahoma City. Agents and local officers traveled rural highways, questioning farmers, storekeepers, and gas station attendants. They carried descriptions of the two kidnappers. One tall, stocky, possibly in his 30s. The other shorter, leaner, armed with what witnesses described as a machine rifle. The phrasing confused some. Few civilians could distinguish a Thompson submachine gun from a rifle, but the implication was unmistakable. Whoever had carried such a weapon had access to military-grade arms, rare outside the circles of professional criminals. Back at the Urschel home, the press waited for official statements. Reporters scribbled details as agents moved in and out of the house, hauling evidence bags and typewritten reports. Flashbulbs popped. The front lawn, once immaculate, was now trampled with footprints from police and journalists alike. Despite orders to maintain silence, a few facts leaked. The use of a machine gun, the mistaken abduction of a second man, the possible connection to organized gangs operating out of Texas. By evening, newspapers across the country would carry the story under bold headlines: "Oil magnate kidnapped by gunmen in Oklahoma City." As daylight faded, the Bureau's temporary command post in Oklahoma City began transmitting hourly updates to Washington. The first day's findings filled pages of telegrams, suspect descriptions, vehicle data, route analysis, and preliminary witness statements. Hoover reviewed each personally, before forwarding condensed versions to the Department of Justice. His control over information was absolute. Nothing left the Bureau without his approval. To the public, the case appeared to be unfolding locally. In reality, it was already being managed from the director's office more than 1,000 miles away. Night returned with the same oppressive heat that had marked the night before. The investigation slowed only slightly as darkness fell. Patrol cars combed highways leading toward the Texas border, their searchlights sweeping fields and creek beds. At rural gas stations, attendants were questioned about cars refueling after midnight. Some recalled seeing unfamiliar vehicles, others nothing at all. The country roads were too many, the evidence too thin. Inside the Urschel house, the Bureau's agents reviewed their notes. Mrs. Urschel and the Jarretts, now resting under watch, were the only direct witnesses. The psychological toll of the event was clear, but their cooperation remained steady. They understood the stakes. The kidnappers would almost certainly contact the family within days, and the Bureau needed them prepared. Hoover's orders were specific. All communications would be handled under federal supervision, every letter or call traced, every exchange controlled. By the end of July 23rd, the first 24 hours had yielded only fragments of the larger picture. 2 unidentified men, a probable escape route, and the possibility of interstate movement. Yet within those fragments lay the foundation of the case that would soon define the Bureau's rise to power. At headquarters, Hoover drafted the first internal memorandum of the operation. It summarized the events succinctly. Subject: abduction of Charles F. Urschel, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, July 22, 1933. Summary: victim believed to have been seized by 2 armed men employing a machine gun. 1 associate released. Preliminary investigation indicates organized criminal activity with possible interstate transport. Bureau assuming coordination pending confirmation of federal jurisdiction. The memo was distributed to every regional office by nightfall. Across the country, agents read the same words, unaware that this case, still without ransom, without suspects, without resolution, would soon become one of the Bureau's most celebrated victories. In the darkness outside Nichols Hills, the Urschel property finally grew quiet. The police lines had been withdrawn, and the reporters dispersed. Only the Bureau's guards remained, patrolling the perimeter under orders to prevent intrusion or interference. The porch lamp still glowed faintly, its light spilling across the gravel drive where tire tracks had already begun to fade under the dust of the new day. Miles away, in the rural expanse between Oklahoma and Texas, the kidnapper's car rested inside a barn. Its engine was cold, its license plates replaced, its cargo secured. Inside the nearby farmhouse, Charles Urschel lay awake, listening to the muffled sounds of his captors moving in the next room. He had counted every turn, memorized every scent, and fixed in his mind the details that would later expose them all. For now he waited, patient and unbroken, as the investigation that would determine his fate gathered momentum hundreds of miles away. The first day ended as it had begun, in silence. But the Bureau's machine was now in motion, and every mile of road between Oklahoma City and the Texas plains would soon be under scrutiny. The abduction that had begun as a midnight crime was transforming, hour by hour, into a national pursuit that would test the reach of the federal government itself. By the 4th morning after the abduction, the silence had begun to stretch into dread. The Bureau's men waited for the inevitable. The first communication from the kidnappers. In kidnapping cases, ransom letters were as predictable as sunrise, and each day without one brought new anxiety to the command post in Oklahoma City. Agents worked in shifts, rotating between the Urschel residence, the local telegraph office, and the post office depot, tracking every envelope that bore a return from out of state. The air inside headquarters was heavy with cigarette smoke and tension, punctuated by the clatter of typewriters recording every rumor, every anonymous call, every whispered lead that drifted in from the public. On the morning of July 26th, at precisely 10 o'clock, the waiting ended. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, oilman J.G. Catlett, a trusted friend of Charles F. Urschel, received a small brown paper package via Western Union. Its postmark was blurred, but the routing stamp read Joplin, Missouri. The contents were methodical. A personal letter from Urschel, written in his own hand, another addressed directly to Catlett, requesting him to serve as intermediary, and a typewritten note from the kidnappers outlining the ransom demand: $200,000 in used $20 Federal Reserve notes. The message was unemotional, precise in spelling, mechanical in tone. Every line reinforced the same point: no law enforcement involvement, no tracing, no substitution of serial numbers. Within an hour, the package was in the hands of the Bureau's field agents. They photographed every sheet before returning the originals to Catlett, under controlled supervision. The Bureau's policy was clear: intervention could not jeopardize the victim's safety. The agents would watch, guide, and document, but they would not act. The priority remained the safe recovery of Urschel. The same morning, the Urschel residence received its own letter. It was addressed to E. Kirkpatrick, a business associate of the victim. The instructions were elaborate, directing him to secure the $200,000 immediately. and to insert a coded advertisement in the daily Oklahoman newspaper reading. For sale, 160 acres land. Good 5-room house. Deep well. Also cows, tools, tractor, corn, and hay. $3,750 for quick sale. Terms. Box ox. The ad would serve as a public signal that the ransom was ready. Only after its publication would the kidnappers initiate further contact. Inside the Bureau's temporary headquarters, agents gathered around the table where the letters were laid out under glass. The language was strikingly professional. No slang, no emotional outburst, no sign of impulsiveness. The phrasing suggested an educated writer with knowledge of business correspondence. Each letter had been typed on a machine with a distinctive misaligned E, an identifying feature that the Bureau's laboratory immediately logged for future comparison. Hoover, briefed by secure telegram that evening, approved the Bureau's decision to monitor but not interfere. His response was terse. Observe, record, protect the victim. That night, Catlett and Kirkpatrick followed the kidnappers' demands to the letter. The advertisement appeared in the Daily Oklahoman the following morning. Across the nation, newspaper readers glanced at it, without realizing it marked the next stage in one of the decade's most significant federal manhunts. For the Bureau, the printed words were a waiting game. Every mailroom from Oklahoma City to Tulsa was placed under covert observation. 3 days passed before the kidnappers moved again. On July 28th, another envelope arrived at the newspaper's anonymous box number, mailed from Joplin, Missouri. The same origin as before, it contained a second letter, addressed again to Kirkpatrick. The instructions were now specific, outlining the transfer plan in a level of detail that revealed the kidnappers' confidence and discipline. The ransom was to be packed in a light-colored leather bag and delivered aboard train number 28, the Sooner bound for Kansas City, via the MK&T lines. Kirkpatrick was to ride on the observation platform at the rear of the train. Along the route between Oklahoma City and Kansas City, he would see 2 fires lit beside the track. After passing the second fire, he was to throw the bag onto the right side of the tracks. If no fires appeared, he was to continue to Kansas City and register at the Moylabach Hotel, under the alias E. Kincaid of Little Rock, Arkansas, awaiting further instructions. The letter concluded with the kidnapper's signature threat: any attempt at trickery would result in Urschel's death. The Bureau examined the letter line by line. The coordination implied multiple operatives, stationed along hundreds of miles of rail line, something only a well-funded, experienced criminal network could execute. Hoover's instructions to his agents remained cautious. The Bureau would allow the ransom delivery to proceed unimpeded. Surveillance would exist, only in the periphery, invisible and non-interfering. No risk to the hostage could be tolerated. On July 29th, the money was prepared under Bureau supervision. Bank officials withdrew $200,000 and used $20 bills from the Federal Reserve Bank, 10th District. Each bill's serial number recorded by hand and typed into master ledgers. The process took hours. 2 identical Gladstone bags were purchased, 1 genuine, 1 dummy. The authentic ransom filled the first. The second, identical in weight, was packed with old magazines, in case of hijacking. At dusk, the 2 men chosen for the delivery, E. Kirkpatrick and J.G. Catlett, arrived at the Oklahoma City station. The Bureau had men on the platform, posing as travelers, their observation discreet. The Sooner was a mixed train of passengers and mail, its cars lined with open-windowed compartments, and a rear observation deck. As the locomotive's whistle cut the evening air, Kirkpatrick boarded with the ransom bag, taking his assigned place at the rear. Catlett, by pre-arrangement, sat just inside the car, close enough to see the platform, but not visible from outside. At 10:10 p.m., the train pulled out of Oklahoma City, its steel wheels striking sparks as it gathered speed. The Bureau's agents watching from the station noted the moment precisely. Every mile of track northbound would now be monitored. Telegraph operators along the route were instructed to log any suspicious fires or light signals. The journey into the night was long and uneventful. Kirkpatrick remained on the observation platform, gripping the leather bag under his arm, eyes fixed on the right-of-way beyond the rails. The prairie stretched out in darkness, punctuated by the occasional lantern light of distant farmhouses. The rhythmic clatter of wheels merged with the wind rushing past the platform. Every few miles, he scanned the horizon for the promised fires. None appeared. Inside the train, Catlett maintained his position, pretending to read a newspaper, while checking his pocket watch. The Bureau's instructions were clear: no independent action, no deviation. If the fires appeared, the bag would be thrown. If not, the delivery would continue to Kansas City, exactly as instructed. As the train crossed into Kansas, the night deepened. Telegraph wires hummed with routine dispatches. No anomalies reported. Somewhere along the route, in darkness unseen, the kidnappers must have been watching, waiting for the signal to succeed. It never came. The train pressed northward without interruption, the ransom still intact. By morning of July 30th, the sooner reached Kansas City. The air was heavy with soot and humidity. Kirkpatrick and Catlett disembarked at Union Station and proceeded directly to the Muhlebach Hotel, the pre-arranged fallback point. Kirkpatrick registered under the alias E.E. Kincaid, room number 913. Bureau surveillance occupied adjacent rooms, maintaining invisibility. The operation was now in its most precarious stage. No communication, no contact, and a live ransom awaiting collection. At 5:30 p.m., a telephone call reached Kirkpatrick's room. The voice on the other end identified itself as Moore, referencing a telegram sent earlier that day. Owing to unavoidable incident, unable to keep appointed. We'll phone you about 6. The caller instructed Kirkpatrick to take the bag and leave the hotel in a taxi for the LaSalle Hotel, then walk 2 blocks west. He was to come alone. The bureau agents in Kansas City had anticipated such a move. Hoover's order forbade interference, but required full observation. Agents positioned themselves along possible routes, blending with pedestrians. At 6 p.m., Kirkpatrick exited the Muhlebach, carrying the light-colored bag. He entered a taxi, gave the driver the address, and arrived at the LaSalle Hotel minutes later. Stepping onto the sidewalk, he began walking west. The street was crowded with early evening traffic, the air thick with exhaust and heat. Half a block from the hotel, a man approached, well-dressed, hat pulled low. Without hesitation, he reached for the bag, stating his intent as though following a script. Kirkpatrick released it, remembering his instructions. No resistance, no deviation. The exchange lasted seconds. The stranger turned, disappeared into the flow of pedestrians, and was gone. Kirkpatrick returned to the hotel. The weight of responsibility lifted, but replaced by uncertainty. There were no further instructions, no confirmation of success. By train and automobile, he and Catlett began the journey back to Oklahoma City. That night, as the 2 men traveled home, bureau agents compiled the first comprehensive summary of the ransom phase. The delivery had occurred precisely as the kidnappers demanded. The $200,000 was gone. There had been no fires, no gunmen, no visible surveillance breach. The operation's precision impressed even Hoover, who received the report shortly before midnight. His directive remained unchanged: maintain silence, continue observation, and await the victim's return. In the Oklahoma City command post, the agents worked under dim lights, the hum of teletypes echoing against the walls. The ledger of serial numbers lay open on the table, a roadmap for the next stage of the investigation. Every bank in the region would soon receive copies for monitoring. When the bills resurfaced, as ransom bills always did, the Bureau would follow the paper trail back to the source. As July 30th turned toward midnight, the final act of the ransom exchange drew to a close. In a quiet Oklahoma farmhouse far from the city, Charles F. Urschel still lay bound, unaware that the money for his freedom had already changed hands. The kidnappers moved quietly through the house, preparing for their next phase. The sound of distant thunder rolled across the plains, a storm gathering over northern Texas. For the Bureau, the night marked both progress and paralysis. The ransom had been paid, the trail temporarily cold, but the system of investigation was fully mobilized. The myth of Machine Gun Kelly, still only a name whispered among agents, had not yet surfaced in the reports. That revelation would come soon enough. For now, the case rested on silence, a waiting game between a captive oilman, his unseen captors, and a federal agency learning case by case how to wage war on the modern criminal. The train that had carried the ransom north now sat in its siding under the depot lights of Kansas City, its cars empty, its windows streaked with dust. The platform was quiet, the night thick with heat. Somewhere in that darkness, a bag of marked bills had already vanished into the criminal network that would soon expose itself, piece by piece, under the relentless weight of federal pursuit. When the car left the outskirts of Oklahoma City, the road ahead dissolved into darkness. The Chevrolet sedan carried its 2 gunmen and their blindfolded captive across a patchwork of unpaved routes that wound through the rural heart of the state. Inside, the air smelled of gasoline and dust. The kidnappers spoke little. The machine gun lay across the knees of the man in the front seat. The other drove with one hand, his pistol resting on the dashboard. Between them sat Charles F. Urschel, silent, wrists bound, his ears muffled with cotton and adhesive tape. He listened anyway. The rhythm of the tires changed as the car left gravel for dirt, then for a narrow wooden bridge that clattered beneath its weight. The wind shifted. He could smell oil and hear the distant groan of pumping engines. 2 stops broke the journey. Once for fuel, 15 minutes, maybe less, and again for the opening of a metal gate. Each sound imprinted itself in his mind. Stripped of sight, he recorded the world by sequence, counting the minutes between turns, memorizing the incline of the road, the pattern of acceleration and braking. Fear had sharpened into discipline. Near 3 in the morning, the car entered an enclosed space. its engine echoing against wood. Tools clanked. Metal scraped metal. The kidnappers were changing license plates. Another vehicle waited inside, a large 7-passenger sedan. Urschel was guided from one car to the other, and told to lie on a padded berth. The new engine started with a deeper rumble. Smoother. Powerful. They drove again for hours. Once more he felt the car tilt through gates. Then the tires crunching gravel. Then boards underfoot. When they finally stopped, the air outside was heavy and humid. He heard chickens, and the faint lowing of cattle. The men led him into a small frame house. Inside, he was placed on an iron cot. A door shut behind him. And somewhere nearby, a woman's voice drifted through a wall. Soft, indistinct, arguing quietly, with one of the men. Then silence. Morning brought rain. Even through the tape on his ears, Urschel could hear it beating against the roof. The kidnappers moved about the house, their boots thudding across wooden floors. He smelled coffee, frying meat, damp earth. When they entered his room, they replaced the blindfold with one made from folded cotton, held by adhesive tape. He was allowed to sit up and eat from a small plate. Through the muffled blur of his vision, he could see only shapes. 2 men, one heavier, both wearing work clothes. The taller man spoke often, his tone commanding. The house was crude but tidy. He noted the floorboards, the single window covered by a blanket, the door that latched from the outside. Somewhere beyond the wall came the steady creak of a wind-driven water pump. From the smell, he guessed they were near farmland, possibly an oil lease road. His food was plain: bread, eggs, milk served in a tin cup that tasted of rust. That afternoon he was moved again. The men wrapped a cloth around his eyes and led him outside, along a narrow boardwalk slick from the rain. He counted each step until they reached another car. The drive lasted about 15 minutes. When it ended, they entered a second house, smaller, quieter. Here he was placed in a corner on blankets and told to remain still. He heard a woman's voice again, different from the first, younger perhaps, speaking with the same local accent. Later he realized this was Ora Shannon, mother of Catherine Kelly, and her family lived nearby. The kidnappers maintained rigid control. During daylight hours, one man always remained in the room, reading newspapers or cleaning a pistol. At night they locked the door and kept a light burning in the adjoining kitchen. Urschel was allowed minimal movement. On the second evening, one of them attached a handcuff to his wrist and fastened it to a chair leg. The noise of the metal closing around him was sharp in the stillness. He registered it carefully. The weight, the chain's length, the number of links. Time passed in fragments of sound and smell. Morning brought the crowing of roosters, the squeal of a pump handle, the laughter of a child outside. He heard the distant rumble of an airplane overhead, at almost the same hour each day. Once near 9:45 in the morning, again at 5:45 in the evening. Each flyover vibrated faintly through the thin roof boards. He began marking the intervals by counting under his breath, synchronizing them with the faint movements of light through his blindfold. The kidnappers were cautious but careless in talk. They discussed money, routes, and other criminals, believing their captive too helpless to understand. One mentioned Bonnie and Clyde, dismissing them as reckless amateurs. Another bragged about 25 years of stealing, and about a bank job in Clinton, Iowa. They had declined because the getaway looked poor. From such remarks, Urschel inferred that both men were seasoned criminals with national reach. He memorized the pitch of their voices. The heavier one nasal and deliberate, the lighter sharp and quick. The days blurred together. Rain returned on the 5th day, heavy enough to flood the yard. He heard one man curse as he stepped outside, boots sucking through mud. The sound of the pump rope straining over its pulley confirmed that they were drawing water from a well northwest of the house. When the bucket rose, it squeaked rhythmically against the frame, the chain rattling as it tipped into a pail. These details, trivial in the moment, became markers in his mental map. Food remained consistent: eggs, bread, milk, sometimes beans. He detected the smell of livestock every time the door opened: pigs, cows, chickens. Once he caught the odor of gasoline close by, suggesting a vehicle parked nearby, or a generator in use. Each clue narrowed his sense of place. The captor's caution showed experience but not sophistication. They underestimated the perception of a man trained to observe detail. On July 27, after the ransom letters had already reached Tulsa and Oklahoma City, the kidnappers discussed the next phase. Urschel gathered that their associates were communicating through intermediaries, waiting for confirmation of payment. The men seemed confident. That night they replaced the chair restraint with a longer chain attached to his wrist, allowing limited movement around the room. He stretched carefully, listening to the scrape of metal on wood. The old man who occasionally brought food mentioned tending 4 milk cows. The information, offered casually, became another point of reference. Urschel noted the consistency of the milk and the metallic aftertaste of the water, which suggested high mineral content, common in North Texas wells. The environmental clues converged toward a region he knew by reputation: Wise County, where his business dealings had once taken him. He filed the conclusion silently. On July 29, the atmosphere in the house changed. The men spoke more often in whispers. They left for long periods, returning with the smell of tobacco and dust on their clothes. Late that night, one of them entered the room and sat heavily on a chair near the cot, sighing audibly. He spoke to the other man about the train and the Oklahoma City job, both phrases that Urschel stored away without reaction. By Sunday, July 30, a violent storm swept across the plains. The rain struck the roof with force, and lightning illuminated the room even through the blindfold. That morning, the usual airplane did not pass overhead. Urschel noted the deviation immediately. The same storm delayed the Fort Worth to Amarillo air route, a fact the Bureau would later verify, matching his recollection precisely to the weather records of the Paradise, Texas area. That evening, the kidnappers returned earlier than usual. They spoke in tense voices, their footsteps heavy on the floor. One packed supplies into a satchel, the other checked the lock on the front door twice. Urschel remained silent, feigning fatigue. He heard the sound of a car engine, starting outside, idling briefly before driving away. Hours later it returned. Doors slammed, a key turned, something metallic jingled. The sound of coins or keys striking one another. The next day brought an abrupt change. Around 2 in the afternoon, July 31, one of the men entered and announced that Urschel would soon be released. The tone was businesslike, final. They removed his blindfold, allowing him to see for the first time since the night of the abduction. The room was small, its walls bare wood, light seeping through cracks in the shutters. A wooden table stood near the window. Beside it, a child's high chair, unused but present. Through the door he glimpsed the edge of a kitchen where dishes hung from pegs, and a kerosene lamp smoked on a counter. He memorized everything. The grain of the boards, the color of the curtains, the shape of the table legs. When they led him outside, he looked downward through narrowed eyes, feigning weakness, but cataloging each detail. The wooden steps, the boardwalk leading to the yard, the pump northwest of the house, the direction of its handle, the alignment of the barn, and the road beyond. In the yard he counted chickens, and noticed a fenced pen, where hogs rooted in mud. The air carried the sour sweet odor of livestock mixed with the sharp tang of mineral soil. A car waited on the dirt road, a sedan with its plates newly affixed. The men guided him into the back seat, and drove east. After 20 minutes, the landscape opened into flat fields. The sun was lowering behind thin clouds. Heat shimmered above the road. Urschel felt the tires change from mud to gravel, then to paved highway. He kept counting. Eventually the car slowed, turned, and stopped. One of the men stepped out, scanned the road, then opened the rear door. Urschel was given $10 and told to walk forward until he reached the main road. The car pulled away, leaving him standing alone. When the sound of the engine faded, he removed the blindfold completely. The horizon stretched empty, except for a distant line of trees. A road sign nearby read Norman, 6 miles. He walked toward town, legs stiff, throat dry. The first farmhouse he reached stood dark and silent. The second had a light. The occupant, startled by his appearance, helped him inside, gave him water, and telephoned the authorities. By nightfall, Charles F. Urschel was back in Oklahoma City. Exhausted, underweight, but alive. He greeted the Bureau's agents, who had waited for news since the ransom drop. After 9 days of captivity, he carried in his mind a complete record of his ordeal. Every sound, smell, and direction had been stored with near scientific precision. Over the next hours, he dictated a statement so detailed that the agents filled dozens of pages. He described the cotton stuffed in his ears, the squeak of the pump handle, the mineral taste of the well water, the livestock surrounding the house, and the pattern of passing airplanes. He recalled the rain on July 30, the absence of the morning flight that day, and the voices of an older couple he believed were caretakers. He described 2 houses, a boardwalk, a narrow gate, and the precise distance between structures. His testimony gave the Bureau its first tangible direction. Weather records, air route schedules, and topographic maps would soon confirm his recollections point for point, narrowing the possible location to a small cluster of farms near Paradise, Texas, including those belonging to the Shannon family, relatives of Catherine Kelly. That night, as Urschel rested under guard, Bureau agents compiled his notes into formal reports, bound for Washington. Hoover read the summaries. Before dawn, the case that had begun as a single violent intrusion on a summer night was now becoming a model of modern investigation. Sensory evidence, cross-checked with meteorology, aviation schedules, and geographic analysis. In the fields of Wise County, the houses that had held him stood quiet, their windows dark. The kidnappers believed themselves safe, unaware that their captive had transformed every moment of their crime into data precise enough to lead federal agents directly to their doors. The storm clouds that had hung over the plains began to drift eastward. In their wake lay a trail invisible to the kidnappers, but perfectly clear to the Bureau. a chain of time, sound, and geography that would soon close the distance between paradise and justice. The summer night pressed heavy over Oklahoma City, a dry heat lingering long after sundown. By the time the first reports reached the Bureau's field office, the city had settled into uneasy quiet. At approximately 11:30 p.m., word came through the switchboard that Charles F. Urschel had been found alive near Norman, Oklahoma, released by his abductors after 9 days in captivity. The message, relayed through local police and confirmed by an agent on duty, spread across the command post like an electric current. Within minutes, the Oklahoma City office was in motion. Lights snapped on, doors opened, telephones rang in succession. In the Urschel home, the long vigil ended in sudden commotion. Cars converged along the narrow street outside the mansion, engines idling in the dark. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as government sedans and police vehicles filled the block. Agents moved quickly through the house, clearing rooms, securing windows, and preparing for the arrival of the victim. Inside, Mrs. Urschel waited in the parlor, pale and motionless, her eyes fixed on the front door. At 11:45 p.m., the car carrying Urschel arrived. He stepped out slowly, clothes disheveled, face drawn but unbroken. The flashbulbs of local photographers cut through the night air as he crossed the porch and entered his home. Agents guided him to a quiet room away from the press outside. The smell of disinfectant and perspiration clung to him. His hands bore faint abrasions from the manacles. When he sat, his posture remained upright, his movements deliberate. Even in exhaustion, he radiated composure. Special agents from the Bureau's Oklahoma City office, already briefed by Washington, began the formal debriefing immediately. The process was precise, almost clinical. Typewriters clattered as two stenographers recorded every detail. Each statement was repeated, confirmed, and cross-checked for time and sequence. Urschel began. From the moment the gunman had entered his porch, during the bridge game, 9 nights earlier, his voice was steady but distant, as if recounting a business transaction, rather than a crime. He described the car's route, the number of turns, the texture of the road, and the duration between stops. He noted the smell of oil wells, the change in air pressure that suggested elevation, the timing of each airplane passing overhead, and the sound of water drawn from a nearby well. Every fact was measured, organized, and offered with precision. Agents realized quickly that they were listening to an extraordinary witness. Urschel's mind had not drifted into panic during captivity. It had worked like an instrument. Deprived of sight, he had cataloged the world around him through sound, touch, and smell. His recollection of the planes, always 2 per day, one at 9:45 a.m., another at 5:45 p.m., provided the first tangible anchor for geographical mapping. His account of rainfall on July 30, coinciding with the absence of the morning plane, would later narrow the search to a specific region of North Texas. The agents pressed him for sensory details, any unique sound or object that could identify a location. Urschel mentioned the squeaking of a well pulley, the metallic taste of the water, and the presence of livestock close enough to hear and smell. He remembered 2 distinct houses, one larger, one smaller, separated by a short drive. He recalled a boardwalk, a baby's high chair, and a tin cup used for water. He remembered the feel of chain links attached to his wrist, and the voice of an older man who spoke of 4 milk cows. Every fragment was transcribed and arranged chronologically. A team of clerks began correlating his statements against known flight routes, rainfall records, and topographic maps kept on file. Another agent telephoned the U.S. Weather Bureau in Dallas to confirm rainfall patterns across the region. A third contacted American Airways to obtain schedules for all flights operating between Fort Worth and Amarillo. The room became a controlled frenzy of coordination. Telephones ringing, papers shuffled, ashtrays filling as cigarettes burned to ash. Outside, reporters gathered along the curb, their notebooks ready. Police officers held them back from the property line. The story of the kidnapping had dominated national headlines for a week. The victim's return transformed it into a national event. Inside, however, the Bureau enforced strict silence. No statement was issued. No photograph was released. Hoover's directive, wired from Washington within the hour, was unequivocal. Protect the integrity of the investigation and the safety of future witnesses. Shortly before midnight, the first full written transcript of Urschel's statement was completed. It filled nearly 30 pages. Agents initialed each sheet, time-stamped them, and forwarded copies to Washington via secured pouch. The original remained in Oklahoma City, under lock. As the night deepened, the Bureau's on-site leadership convened a closed meeting. Present were Special Agent in Charge Frank Blake, the senior field investigator, and representatives from the local police. Maps were spread across a table under a single lamp. Using Urschel's account, they began marking potential regions that fit his description: unpaved roads, oil wells, consistent air traffic overhead, and recent rainfall. The search grid extended roughly 600 miles southward. At the same time, the FBI laboratory in Washington prepared to analyze the kidnappers' ransom letters. The misaligned E on the typewriter remained the only direct mechanical clue to their identity. Chemical analysts had already dusted the envelopes for latent prints and examined the paper fibers for manufacturing marks. Every lead, however minor, was entered into a centralized file system now expanding by the hour. Back in Oklahoma City, Urschel rested briefly, then resumed dictation. His focus turned to the people involved. He described two primary kidnappers. One tall, deliberate, speaking with authority. The other shorter, quicker, more impulsive. He believed both were accustomed to command and unafraid of violence. He mentioned the voices of a man and woman in adjoining rooms, suggesting that the kidnappers were supported by others, possibly family. This detail struck the agents immediately. It implied a network, not a small criminal pair. Every statement was logged against time and environment. The agents noted how Urschel never exaggerated, never speculated beyond what he knew. His precision lent his testimony, the quality of evidence rather than recollection. By 1:30 a.m., Hoover had received a full teletype summary in Washington. The director read it twice, marking key phrases in pencil. Airplane schedule. Consistent. Rainfall. July 30. Livestock. Mineral water. 2 houses. Boardwalk. High chair. He issued new orders within minutes. The Bureau would establish a data correlation unit dedicated solely to the Urschel case. Flight patterns, meteorological data and oil field maps would be cross-referenced overnight. He emphasized that this case would serve as a demonstration of federal reach and discipline under the new Lindbergh kidnapping law, enacted earlier that year. In the Oklahoma City office, fatigue set in, but no one left their post. Agents moved between desks, comparing notes. The teletype clattered with incoming messages from other field offices reporting on unrelated leads, false sightings, anonymous letters, and crank calls claiming knowledge of the kidnapper's identity. Each was logged, numbered, and discarded. If unsupported, the Bureau's focus had narrowed entirely to the tangible evidence provided by Urschel's testimony. At 2:00 a.m., a new telegram arrived from the Bureau's Dallas office, confirming that American Airways flights between Fort Worth and Amarillo passed directly over Wise County, Texas, near the town of Paradise, at approximately 9:40 a.m. and 5:40 p.m. every day. The data aligned perfectly with Urschel's timing. Another message from the Weather Bureau confirmed heavy rainfall in that same region on July 30, the first major storm since May. The pieces began to fit. Agents marked the area on their map with a pencil. 2 red circles, one around Paradise, another around the nearby community of Bridgeport. The information would require confirmation on the ground. But for the first time since the kidnapping, the Bureau had a geographic anchor. Hoover's reaction, transmitted through encrypted wire, was measured but unmistakably urgent. Develop leads quietly. No arrests until full identification. Protect secrecy of location. By 3:00 a.m., the debriefing concluded. Urschel, pale and visibly drained, leaned back in his chair as agents collected the final pages of his statement. He had not slept since his release, yet his composure never faltered. When asked if he could identify the kidnapper's property, if shown photographs, he nodded once. The agents understood that his memory, his ability to connect minute sensory impressions, had become the Bureau's most valuable instrument. He was escorted upstairs to rest. Under guard, 2 agents remained stationed outside his room through the night. In the hallway below, the office hummed with low voices. The smell of tobacco thickened the air. Clerks typed final reports while telephones connected Oklahoma City to Washington, Dallas, Fort Worth, and Tulsa in a constant loop of coordination. Downstairs, the maps on the table remained illuminated under a single desk lamp. The lines drawn by Urschel's recollections converged neatly over the Texas border. The agents studying them understood the implication. The kidnappers were not local bandits, but professionals operating across state lines. A federal crime under the new law, and therefore under full FBI jurisdiction. Outside, the night had cooled. The line of cars that had crowded the street earlier was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of cicadas. Inside, the Bureau's men worked until dawn, drafting memoranda that would guide the next phase of the investigation. The field search that would expose the Shannon ranches, and eventually, George and Catherine Kelly. At 4:15 a.m., the last teletyped report of the night left the building, addressed to Hoover personally. It summarized the key breakthroughs. Subpoenaed, victim recovered unharmed, ransom payment verified delivered. Flight schedules and rainfall data correlate with victim's account. Probable area of captivity, Wise County, Texas, near Paradise. Immediate field reconnaissance recommended. Hoover read it within minutes of receipt in Washington. He annotated one line at the bottom before forwarding it to his deputies. Pursue leads at first light. Confirm site. Prepare for coordinated federal action. As dawn began to break over the city, the Bureau's temporary command center grew quiet. The agents who had been awake for 36 hours finally stepped outside into the pale light. Somewhere to the south, in the farmlands of Texas, two houses stood silent among fields of corn and dust. Inside those houses lay the evidence of a crime that had drawn the full attention of the United States government. For the first time since the abduction, the Bureau had control of the case. The victim had returned, alive and precise. The investigation had shifted from uncertainty to direction. The night of July 31 ended not with relief, but with resolution. The federal pursuit had begun in earnest. The morning after Charles Urschel's return, the Bureau's Oklahoma City field office became a laboratory of deduction. On every desk lay copies of the victim's statement. 30 typed pages dense with time codes, distances, and sensory impressions. Agents worked through each line with pencils and rulers, converting fragments of memory into coordinates. The air smelled of tobacco and carbon paper. Maps covered the walls, Oklahoma to the north, Texas spreading southward in pale contour lines. The investigation had entered its analytical phase. For the first time in its history, the Federal Bureau of Investigation would rely not on chance informants or confessions, but on pattern analysis, weather data, aviation schedules, and geographic correlation. It was the logical extension of J. Edgar Hoover's insistence that crime be met with method, rather than improvisation. At 9 o'clock, teletypes clattered to life. From Washington came Hoover's instruction: cross-reference rainfall, air routes, and regional geography against the witness statement. Confirm location before movement. The director's tone, precise and unyielding, carried through every line. In Oklahoma City, Special Agent Frank Blake coordinated the response. He divided the field team into 3 sections: aviation, meteorology, and topography, and assigned clerks to compile external data. Each group worked independently, but reported hourly, their findings assembled in a growing dossier titled Urschel Investigation, Phase 2. The first data arrived from the Weather Bureau in Dallas. Rainfall records for July 1933. Columns of figures showed that nearly all of North Texas had suffered drought from late May until a single heavy storm on July 30. The same day, Urschel recalled hearing rain hammer the roof of his prison and noticing the absence of the morning airplane. The correlation was immediate and exact. Red ink circled the entry for Wise County, 1.12 inches, July 30. It was the only recorded rainfall within 200 miles that matched the date precisely. Within hours, a second confirmation arrived from American Airways. Their dispatch logs indicated that the Fort Worth to Amarillo flight, northbound at 9:15 a.m., southbound at 3:30 p.m., passed directly over Paradise, Texas, a small settlement northwest of Fort Worth. The timing of each flight, over the region at roughly 9:40 a.m. and 5:40 p.m., aligned perfectly with Urschel's recollection of the morning and evening planes. The coincidence was too exact to ignore. By noon, the Bureau's wall map bore its first decisive mark: a red circle around Paradise, labeled probable holding area. Field agents were dispatched south that same afternoon. Their orders were explicit: travel in civilian clothing, make no arrests, and conduct observations under pretense. They carried aerial charts, magnifying compasses, and photographs of the countryside provided by the U.S. Geological Survey. Each man was trained to notice the same details Urschel had cataloged: livestock patterns, road types, boardwalks, wells, and the spacing between farmhouses. Meanwhile, back in the Oklahoma City office, technicians compiled supporting evidence. The ransom letters were re-examined. The misaligned E on the kidnapper's typewriter was matched against known machines, seized from earlier raids in Texas and Arkansas. None fit perfectly, but one specimen, recovered months earlier from a counterfeit operation in Fort Worth, produced a near-identical alignment flaw. The possibility of connection reinforced the Texas hypothesis. That night, August 1, the Bureau's first reconnaissance team reached Wise County. The men split into pairs and drove rural roads under the pretext of oil lease inspectors. The countryside lay parched and silent, broken by fields of stunted corn and the silhouettes of windmills against a moonlit sky. Every few miles they stopped to listen. The sound of insects mingled with the rhythmic groan of distant oil pumps, the same sound Urschel had described from his blindfolded nights. Near Paradise, one agent, Ralph Colvin, paused beside a small farmhouse and counted steps from the gate to the porch. He noted a wooden boardwalk leading from house to barn, and a hand-drawn well northwest of the building, its pulley creaking audibly in the wind. He jotted the observations in his notebook and continued on. What he did not yet know was that this property belonged to Robert G. Shannon, stepfather of Catherine Kelly, and that the adjoining ranch, a mile and a half away, belonged to Shannon's son Armon. The following morning, Colvin and his partner returned under daylight pretense, introducing themselves as soil surveyors from Fort Worth. The elder Shannon, a stout man in overalls, greeted them politely. His yard contained chickens, hogs, and the same squealing water pump Urschel had described. The agents noted the details, thanked the farmer, and left without incident. Back in their car, They exchanged a glance. The resemblance to the victim's account was exact, too exact to be coincidence. Their report, wired that evening to Oklahoma City, caused immediate reaction. The office erupted into coordinated preparation. For 10 days the Bureau had worked through abstractions, letters, maps, figures. Now it had a tangible site. Blake ordered photographic equipment, fingerprint kits, and arrest warrants held in readiness. Still, Hoover's standing order remained: no move until confirmation is absolute. To secure that confirmation, another team visited the neighboring ranch owned by Armand Shannon. Under the guise of purchasing cattle feed, they observed a second well, a child's high chair visible through a window, and a rusted chain near the back door. The cumulative detail matched every element of Urschel's recollection. The agents returned north to report their findings. On August 5, the full intelligence summary reached Washington. Hoover read the dossier in silence. Page by page, the evidence trail, rainfall, aircraft timing, environmental correspondence, and field verification formed a perfect chain. His marginal notes were few: proceed with caution, capture alive, if possible. In the days that followed, preparations expanded. The Bureau coordinated with U.S. Marshals in Texas, establishing communication lines with local sheriffs but withholding the targets' identities to preserve secrecy. The operation was to be executed in early morning hours, simultaneously at both Shannon properties. While agents in the field prepared, the Oklahoma City office continued its analysis of the ransom money circulation. Copies of the recorded serial numbers were distributed to banks nationwide. Clerks in Minneapolis, Denver, and Fort Worth were instructed to flag any $20 bill from the Federal Reserve Bank of the 10th District, matching those digits. The Bureau's new central index, built by typists working around the clock, made possible what would later become a standard investigative procedure: tracking money through a national financial network. Meanwhile, in Paradise, the Shannons went about their days unaware of the tightening perimeter. The dry heat returned after the storm, cracking the soil and whitening the roads. The sound of aircraft overhead resumed its daily rhythm. 2 planes, morning and afternoon, their engines a constant reminder of the pattern that had betrayed them. Agents maintained surveillance from rented farmhouses and gas stations, taking photographs with concealed cameras. They noted visitors: a large man matching Harvey Bailey, recently escaped from the Kansas State Penitentiary, and a slender woman resembling Catherine Kelly. Vehicles bearing mismatched license plates came and went at odd hours. Each observation was logged with time and direction. By the end of the first week of August, the Bureau's file on the Urschel case exceeded 300 pages. Every fact derived from the victim's perception had been tested and verified. The precision of the results astonished even veteran investigators. Hoover used the case internally as demonstration material, a manual of disciplined observation, translated into scientific pursuit. On the night of August 10, final authorization arrived from Washington. The operation would commence before dawn. On August 12, the Bureau's men, joined by local law enforcement, would surround the Shannon ranches simultaneously, seize all occupants, and recover evidence before word could spread. Orders emphasized the capture of Harvey Bailey and the retrieval of any weapons or ransom currency on the premises. In the hours before departure, the Oklahoma City field office hummed with restrained energy. Rifles were checked, automobiles fueled, warrants folded into coat pockets. Each team carried explicit instructions: names, locations, and radio signals. There was no margin for improvisation. As the caravans moved south under cover of darkness, the connection between mathematics and pursuit became visible. The Bureau had followed a trail built entirely from sensory fragments: rainfall, flight times, the creak of a well pulley, and transformed them into coordinates precise enough to locate a single farmhouse among thousands. It was investigation reduced to geometry. Shortly before midnight, the first convoy crossed into Texas. The road shimmered under thin moonlight, bordered by fields of corn burned yellow by drought. Ahead lay the faint lights of Paradise, a small cluster of buildings set against the dark horizon. Somewhere beyond those lights, in 2 unremarkable farmhouses, lay the evidence of a crime that had tested the limits of federal jurisdiction and forged the Bureau's emerging identity. As the agents approached their staging point, radios crackled with final instructions. The command was simple: move at dawn. Before sunrise, the countryside northwest of Fort Worth lay still beneath a thin veil of mist. Crickets pulsed in the ditches, oil field pumps clanked rhythmically somewhere in the dark, and a narrow gravel road cut through fields of stunted corn toward 2 modest farmhouses, separated by a 1.5 miles of rolling pasture. The Bureau's convoys halted their engines there at 4:15 a.m. Headlights were switched off. Only the ticking of cooling motors and the faint rustle of men readying weapons disturbed the silence. Each team had rehearsed the plan through the night. One unit, drawn from the Oklahoma City office, would strike the Robert G. Shannon homestead. Another, composed of agents from Dallas and Fort Worth, would move simultaneously on the Armand Shannon ranch to the south. Orders were simple: take every occupant alive, seize papers, weapons, and currency, and secure the site before daybreak. The element of surprise had to hold. Word that the federal government was operating in Wise County would scatter half the criminal underworld of North Texas. At 4:30, the first light edged across the horizon. Agents fanned out through the fields, boots sinking in the damp soil. Shotguns and Thompson submachine guns were cradled low. Revolvers hung from belt holsters wrapped in cloth to muffle metal against metal. The air smelled of dew and livestock. Ahead, the Shannon house appeared as a dark silhouette. 2 stories, wood-framed porch sagging, a windmill creaking beside a shed. From inside came the faint sound of a rooster crowing, followed by the thud of someone moving across the floorboards. Special Agent Ralph Colvin raised his hand. The men froze. He motioned 2 forward. They stepped onto the porch, boards flexing under their weight. For a heartbeat there was only the whisper of wind. Then the door burst inward under a single kick, and the stillness of the Texas morning was broken. Inside, confusion erupted. Harvey J. Bailey, one of the most wanted men in America, sat bolt upright, in a chair beside a window, a machine gun propped against the wall within arm's reach. The agents flooded the room before he could move. Bailey's hand went to the weapon, but stopped halfway. As a flashlight beam struck his face, he froze. On a nearby table lay 2 automatic pistols, a half-open suitcase, and bundles of $20 bills held with paper bands. In less than 20 seconds, the room was secured. Bailey, unarmed and glaring, was pulled to his feet, wrists bound with handcuffs. Elsewhere in the house, agents located Robert G. Shannon, his wife Ora L. Shannon, and their son Armand. They offered no resistance. The smell of frying grease lingered from an unfinished breakfast. A pot of coffee steamed on the stove. In the back room, an iron cot stood against the wall, the same type described by Urschel. A baby's high chair sat in the corner beside a tin cup on the windowsill. The floorboards beneath it were still scarred where a chain had scraped against the wood. The agents moved with measured efficiency. Every item was tagged and listed. The machine gun, both pistols, a stack of $1,100 in cash, and a box of assorted ammunition. Within minutes, serial numbers on several of the bills matched those recorded from the Urschel ransom. The confirmation came quietly, passed from hand to hand, a nod, a look, and then noted in a small leather notebook. The evidence was incontrovertible. Outside, dawn had begun to bleed through the low clouds. Cars pulled closer as the first prisoners were let out, blinking against the light. Bailey's jaw was set, expression unreadable. The Shannons followed, their faces pale, clothes rumpled. Behind them, agents carried the seized weapons wrapped in cloth and loaded them into the trunks of Bureau sedans. The operation had lasted less than 15 minutes. Not a shot had been fired. 15 miles away, at the Armand Shannon Ranch, the second team completed its sweep almost simultaneously. The younger Shannon's farmhouse mirrored the first, same orientation of buildings, same well positioned to the northwest. Inside, agents found another cot, blankets on the floor, and a half-burned lantern. The smell of livestock drifted through open windows. On a small table lay food remnants, bread crusts, an eggshell, and a dented plate. One agent tapped the floorboards with his boot, counting steps from door to bed, confirming every spatial detail with the diagram, drawn from Urschel's memory. The match was exact. By 6:00 a.m., both properties were under full control. Federal radios transmitted coded success messages back to Oklahoma City. Target secure. Evidence recovered. Casualties none. Hoover received the update in Washington less than an hour later. The director's brief reply, "Proceed to interrogation and verification," set the tone for what followed. The prisoners were transported separately to Fort Worth under armed escort. The cars moved in convoy through narrow county roads, engines grinding over loose gravel, the early sun flashing across windshields. Locals stepped out of farmhouses to watch as the procession passed. Black sedans filled with federal men, faces stern behind sunglasses, a machine gun visible through an open rear window. By mid-morning, the Bureau had effectively ended one of the largest manhunts of the year, without public disturbance. At headquarters in Oklahoma City, clerks began cataloging the physical evidence shipped from the scene. Each item was photographed, labeled, and cross-referenced against Urschel's earlier testimony. The reports aligned point for point. The chain, the cot, the pump, the mineral water, and even the baby's chair corresponded exactly to his description. The accuracy of his observations astonished investigators. His mental map had guided them to the precise doorstep. Interrogations began that afternoon. The Shannons, confronted with the marked bills and the presence of Bureau men who already knew too much, confessed their role almost immediately. They admitted that Urschel had been held in their houses, that they had served as guards, and that 2 men, George Kelly and Albert Bates, had delivered the prisoner and collected him after the ransom was paid. The statement confirmed suspicions that had circulated quietly within the Bureau since early July. The Kelly name had appeared in scattered reports of liquor running and bank robberies across Texas. Now it was attached to a federal kidnapping case under the Lindbergh Law, carrying mandatory life imprisonment. Agents wasted no time verifying the Shannons' claims. Records from Fort Worth identified Catherine Kelly, daughter of Ora Shannon, as married to a known ex-convict, George R. Kelly Barnes, alias Machine Gun Kelly. Within hours, Hoover's office in Washington issued a nationwide alert: locate and apprehend George R. Kelly, Catherine Kelly, Albert L. Bates, and known associates. Field divisions from Chicago to Denver began tracing known hideouts, vehicle registrations, and wire transfers linked to the pair. Back in Paradise, agents continued their systematic sweep of the property. Soil around the barn was sifted for discarded shell casings. Wells were examined for hidden objects. Every structure was photographed before being sealed. The local sheriff, briefed only after completion, stood aside as federal personnel loaded crates of evidence onto trucks. By mid-afternoon, the rural calm had returned, the chickens still pecking at the ground, the windmill creaking as it turned. The scene looked unchanged, yet its anonymity had been stripped away. What had been an ordinary farm was now a cornerstone in federal criminal history. In Fort Worth, the prisoners sat in adjacent cells under constant watch. Harvey Bailey remained impassive, speaking only when questioned directly. When confronted with the ransom bills found on his person, he offered no denial, only a shrug that the stenographer recorded without comment. The Shannons, by contrast, talked freely. They described how the Kellys had arrived weeks earlier, bringing money, vehicles, and instructions. The family had been promised payment for the use of their property. The old man's role had been to fetch water, his sons to stand guard at night. Each spoke of fear rather than profit. The Bureau verified every element of their account through physical evidence. Fingerprints lifted from the interior walls matched those of known associates of Catherine Kelly, stored in Bureau files. A handwriting comparison on grocery receipts tied them to previous transactions in Fort Worth under her married name. Investigators traced the machine gun seized from Bailey back to a purchase in Fort Worth, made months earlier, by Catherine Kelly herself. The chain of proof tightened. By evening, Hoover had the results on his desk in Washington: ransom currency recovered, primary suspects identified, holding sites confirmed, no civilian casualties. The memorandum concluded simply: operation successful. Yet for the Bureau, success was only partial. The central figures, George and Catherine Kelly, were still at large. The chase now moved from containment to pursuit. Across the nation, news of the raid spread through the press. Before official release, word leaked from county offices that federal men had captured Machine Gun Kelly's hideout. Reporters swarmed the Oklahoma City headquarters, seeking photographs and statements. Hoover authorized only a brief communique confirming arrests in connection with the Urschel kidnapping, and emphasizing that further details were withheld pending investigation. The restraint served two purposes: to preserve operational secrecy, and to shape the narrative of a disciplined scientific bureau, acting under federal law. Meanwhile, agents traced the remaining ransom currency. Serial numbers recovered from the Shannon house provided a pattern that banks could recognize. Within days, identical notes surfaced in Minneapolis, exchanged by intermediaries connected to the liquor trade. The Bureau began mapping the money's movement northward, suspecting it was being laundered through criminal distributors. Each transaction extended the reach of the case beyond Texas and into the broader network that sustained organized crime during the final years of Prohibition. Back in Wise County, the sun set over fields still marked by tire tracks from Bureau cars. Locals spoke of the sudden appearance of federal men and the quiet efficiency with which they departed. To them, it seemed an isolated incident. To Hoover's Bureau, it was proof that a national law enforcement system could act across state lines with precision and authority. The Lindbergh Law, tested for the first time on a scale of this magnitude, had worked. At midnight, on August 12, as the arrested men were booked into federal custody, teletypes carried the closing report of the operation. All objectives completed. Primary suspects in custody. Evidence secured. Recommend immediate pursuit of George and Catherine Kelly and Albert L. Bates. The cables clattered into Washington in a steady rhythm, echoing through the empty corridors of the Department of Justice. Hoover, reading the final dispatch, understood the significance beyond the immediate victory. The Bureau had executed a coordinated multi-state raid, using intelligence derived solely from observation and data. It was not only a capture, it was a demonstration of federal capability. In the quiet that followed, the agents of the Oklahoma City field office cleaned their weapons and packed crates of evidence for transfer. The tin cup, the baby's chair, the machine gun, and the ransom bills were sealed in numbered containers. Each would later appear in court as silent testimony to the precision of the operation. Outside, the Texas night was still again. The windmill turned lazily above the Shannon farm, its blades creaking in rhythm with the insects. The well stood empty. The boardwalk glistened with dew. The place that had once held a bound man counting airplanes had returned to its ordinary silence. Yet the fields around Paradise were no longer anonymous. They were coordinates on the federal map of justice. The trail that began with a bridge game in Oklahoma City now pointed unmistakably toward two fugitives on the run. The Bureau would follow that line across state borders, into cities and safe houses, until it reached the final door. For the men who had stood in the early morning mist of August 12, the mission was not over. It had only entered its next phase. The raid at Paradise had given the Bureau possession of hard evidence: guns, fingerprints, and ransom bills. But not the men who had conceived the crime. George and Catherine Kelly, along with Albert L. Bates, had vanished days before the operation, slipping into the anonymity of highways and border towns. The hunt for them began not with a car chase or a gunfight, but with the quiet movement of paper, $200,000 in marked $20 bills, scattered through the veins of the American economy. In the weeks that followed, the Oklahoma City field office became the clearinghouse for a new form of investigation. Clerks and typists worked in 12-hour rotations, reproducing ledgers of serial numbers recorded before the ransom exchange. Each bill's sequence, tens of thousands of digits, was typed, mimeographed, and distributed to every Federal Reserve Bank and major financial institution in the country. The system was primitive, by modern standards, yet revolutionary. For 1933, a nationwide financial dragnet designed to follow the money wherever it surfaced. The first break came quietly in Minneapolis, Minnesota. On August 21, 1933, a teller at the Hennepin State Bank flagged a deposit of $1,000 in worn $20 notes, whose numbers matched those on the Bureau's list. The customer, a truck driver named Sam Frederick, claimed he had brought the cash for his employer, Charles Urschel, owner of a local transfer company. The transaction seemed routine, but within hours Bureau agents were at the bank, comparing the bills to their master ledger. Every serial number matched. Frederick was located that evening at his small apartment near the freight yards. He was bewildered, but cooperative. He explained that Urschel had sent him to the bank, accompanied by two men he did not know. They had asked him to obtain a cashier's check for $1,800 under the alias S.H. Peters. Frederick had assumed it was a normal business transaction, but the agents recognized the pattern: criminals laundering ransom money through intermediaries. When questioned, Charles Urschel confirmed that he had received a call from a man named Barney, requesting help with a bank errand. The man arrived at his office, accompanied by another individual, both strangers to him. Urschel had refused to go himself, but allowed his driver to make the deposit. The Bureau traced the cashier's check to another Minneapolis institution, the First National Bank and Trust Company, where it had been exchanged for cash by a businessman named Peter Valder. The web widened quickly. Valder told agents he had acted at the request of Edward Barney Berman, a known figure in the Minneapolis underworld associated with liquor smuggling during Prohibition. Berman in turn admitted that the money had come from a man calling himself Collins, who had recently purchased 125 cases of whiskey from his partner Isidore "Kid Can" Blumenfeld, another major distributor. The transaction had totaled $5,500, paid entirely in $20 bills. When the Bureau examined samples of the notes recovered from the banks, they found again the same serial numbers. Through patient reconstruction, the agents followed the path of the ransom money as it passed from Paradise, Texas, through a chain of criminal commerce to Minneapolis, over 1,000 miles away. The bills had moved as payment for liquor shipments, converted to cashier's checks, and redistributed through legitimate businesses. Each link in the chain represented an opportunity for identification. By the end of August, the Bureau's northern field offices were fully engaged. Agents in Minneapolis interviewed Berman, Blumenfeld, and their associate Clifford Skelly, corroborating the details of the whiskey sale. The three admitted the transaction, but insisted they had no knowledge of the money's source. The investigation established, for the first time, a direct economic corridor between the Kelly network and organized bootlegging operations across the Midwest. Meanwhile, in Denver, Colorado, another fragment surfaced. On August 12th, local police had arrested a man for a minor traffic violation. During a search, they found $660 in $20 bills, later confirmed as part of the ransom currency. The man was Albert L. Bates, the same associate named by the Shannons as one of Urschel's kidnappers. The arrest had occurred hours after the Paradise raid, before federal agents even knew Bates was in Colorado. Once identified, he was turned over to the Bureau. In his possession were additional weapons, including another machine gun. The connection between Bates and the Kellys was now undeniable. His capture provided confirmation that the fugitives were moving west, possibly towards safe houses maintained by criminal allies. The Bureau's communications network, still primitive but efficient, relayed daily updates between Oklahoma City, Denver, Minneapolis, and Washington. Every telegram ended with the same instruction from Hoover's office: trace funds, no publicity until confirmation of principal's location. During the final days of August, additional bills surfaced across the country. In Minneapolis, a cousin of Berman's associate deposited $500 at a local bank, also traced to the ransom. Another deposit appeared in Fargo, North Dakota. The money trail, once obscure, had become a series of luminous threads converging toward one name repeated in every interview: Machine Gun Kelly. For the Bureau, the case had evolved beyond the recovery of a kidnapped man. It had become a demonstration of federal reach. Hoover understood the symbolic value. The Lindbergh Law, passed only months earlier, granted federal jurisdiction over kidnappings that crossed state lines. The Urschel case would prove its effectiveness not just through arrests, but through method, meticulous documentation, coordination across multiple field offices, and the use of forensic accounting to dismantle criminal networks. By early September, the Bureau's files on the Kelly case filled entire cabinets. Inside, thousands of cross-referenced documents linked people, places, and transactions. One section detailed Catherine Kelly's background: born Catherine Thorne, daughter of Ora Shannon, widow of Charlie Thorne, and married to George Kelly Barnes, an ex-bootlegger from Tennessee. Another file chronicled George Kelly's criminal record, including his conviction for bootlegging in New Mexico, and his reputation for carrying a Thompson submachine gun, the weapon that gave him his enduring moniker. The investigation now focused on tracing the fugitives themselves. Leads suggested that after leaving Texas, the Kellys had moved through Des Moines, Iowa, and then Chicago, staying briefly with known associates before disappearing. The Bureau coordinated with railroad companies, border checkpoints, and post offices to monitor all shipments and telegrams addressed to aliases used by the pair. On September 4th, Hoover authorized the public release of the identification order for George R. Kelly, describing him as armed, dangerous, and a known associate of bootlegger networks across the Midwest. Photographs from his earlier prison records, stern face, slicked hair, cold eyes, were distributed nationwide. The manhunt expanded from quiet investigation to open pursuit. Back in Oklahoma City, the recovered ransom money was counted and cataloged in the evidence vault. The total confirmed by early September exceeded $70,000, more than a third of the original payment. Each bill served as both proof of guilt and map of connection, linking scattered criminals across a vast geography. The Bureau's analysts recognized that the money itself was speaking, narrating the Kellys' movements through the underworld economy. At the same time, the captured conspirators faced indictment. On August 23, 1933, a federal grand jury in Oklahoma City charged R.G. Shannon, Ora Shannon, Armand Shannon, Albert L. Bates, Harvey Bailey, Clifford Skelly, and Barney Berman with conspiracy to kidnap Charles F. Urschel. The indictment marked one of the earliest large-scale federal prosecutions under the Lindbergh Law. Public reaction was immediate. Newspapers across the country hailed it as evidence that the government had finally found a way to combat interstate crime. While court proceedings advanced, the manhunt intensified. Agents in Chicago tracked reports of a couple matching the Kellys' description, staying under false names in small hotels. Each lead was checked, verified, and often discarded. The fugitives moved constantly, avoiding large cities, using friends of friends for brief shelter. Hoover's office reminded all divisions that the case was not to be resolved with a shootout. The goal was capture, interrogation, and trial, a demonstration of order prevailing over chaos. By mid-September, the money trail converged again. On the south, agents discovered that $73,250 of ransom cash had been hidden on the Coleman Ranch in Texas, property of Cassie Earl Coleman, a known associate of the Kellys. When interrogated, Coleman admitted that Kelly had buried the money in a cotton patch before fleeing the state. The recovery, executed by agents on September 27th, added to the growing mountain of evidence. Each recovery tightened the Bureau's grasp. The marked bills, once a potential liability, became a trap for everyone who had handled them. Hoover's system of serial number dissemination had turned a ransom payment into a tracking device, an innovation that would define financial crime investigations for decades. Meanwhile, reports from the field confirmed sightings of George and Catherine Kelly in Memphis, Tennessee, living quietly at the home of J.C. Tickner, a local acquaintance. Surveillance teams from the Bureau's Birmingham division moved to Memphis undercover, establishing positions around the residence. The operation would require precision. The fugitives were known to be armed and unpredictable. In Washington, Hoover reviewed the accumulating evidence and prepared public strategy. The Bureau's success in tracing the ransom money had already solidified its legitimacy in the eyes of Congress and the press. The next phase, capturing the Kellys themselves, would complete the transformation of a fledgling investigative agency into a symbol of federal authority. As September drew to a close, the case file for the Urschel kidnapping exceeded 1,000 pages. Every page told the same story, from a different angle. A blindfolded oilman counting planes, rainfall over the Texas plains, a trail of cash winding through banks and bootleggers, and a Bureau learning case by case how to fight crime with evidence instead of chance. On the evening of September 25, 1933, Hoover received the final message from his southern agents. Target confirmed. Address 1401 Rainer Street, Memphis. Both subjects present. The director's reply was immediate. Execute before dawn. Capture alive, if possible. Notify Oklahoma City upon completion. The money had done its work. What began as ransom had become a breadcrumb trail, leading across 5 states to a single house in Tennessee. As midnight approached, the Bureau's men gathered quietly in the alleys of Memphis. Their cars parked without lights. The wind moved through the trees, and the city slept unaware. Inside the house, George and Catherine Kelly were ending their last night of freedom. The next act would begin in silence, before dawn. When the phrase that would define an era was shouted into the dark. Before dawn, the city of Memphis lay heavy with late summer heat. The streets were empty except for an occasional streetcar grinding along its rails, and the stray echo of a riverboat whistle from the Mississippi. At 1401 Rainer Street, a modest 2-story frame house stood behind overgrown hedges, its windows shaded, a porch swing motionless in the still air. Inside, George Machine Gun Kelly and his wife Catherine slept in a borrowed bedroom of a man named J.C. Tickenor, unaware that 50 armed men were closing around them. The order for the operation had come the previous night, transmitted directly from J. Edgar Hoover to the Bureau's Birmingham division. Surveillance had confirmed the couple's presence through the evening. Lights observed silhouettes matched, vehicle parked behind the house. The directive was brief: execute at 5 a.m., capture alive, if possible. At 3:45, 3 unmarked sedans and 2 police trucks rolled silently through South Memphis and stopped a block away. Agents stepped into the darkness carrying Thompson submachine guns, revolvers and flashlights wrapped with paper to reduce glare. They spread into position, surrounding the property from alley, yard and street. Inside headquarters across town, a radio operator remained at his console, ear pressed to the speaker, waiting for the signal that would announce completion. The Bureau had learned caution from years of bootleg raids that had ended in gunfire. This would be different: swift, coordinated, and absolute. At 4:45 a.m., Special Agent in Charge Merrill Chubbs gave the final nod. 2 agents crept up the front walk, the boards damp with dew. Another pair covered the rear door. The command was whispered once: go. The front door gave way with a sharp crack. Agents poured through the opening, flashlights slicing the darkness. Upstairs, startled movement, a voice, a thud of feet on bare floorboards. The stairway filled with noise. Orders barked, footsteps pounding, drawers pulled open. In the front bedroom, George Kelly stumbled from the bed, reaching instinctively for a chair where a revolver usually lay. It wasn't there. An agent's beam had already found it. The room erupted in shouts and the glint of gunmetal. For a moment, everything held in suspension. The fugitive blinking into the light, the agents rigid, fingers resting on triggers. Then Kelly's hands went up, his shoulders sagged. He was unarmed. He stood motionless in the glare of 3 flashlights, chest bare, breathing hard. The men closed in, weapons steady, cuffs snapping around his wrists. Catherine Kelly, pale and silent, appeared in the doorway wrapped in a robe. She made no move to resist as agents led her aside. The arrest was over in less than a minute. Outside, the neighborhood remained asleep, unaware that one of the most wanted criminals in the country was being marched across its lawns. A few dogs barked as the convoy pulled away, engines low, headlights dark until the cars reached the main road. Within half an hour, the Kellys were on their way to the Shelby County Jail. At 6:10 a.m., a coded radio message left Memphis subjects secured without resistance. No casualties. Hoover received it in Washington. Less than 10 minutes later, he read the line twice, then underlined the words "without resistance." The case that had begun in gunfire 9 weeks earlier had ended in silence. Back in Memphis, reporters began to gather as the sun climbed above the river. Word had leaked from local police. Federal men had captured Machine Gun Kelly in the early morning hours. By the time the Bureau issued its brief confirmation, the story was already on front pages from Chicago to Dallas. Journalists filled in details as they pleased. That Kelly had shouted, "Don't shoot G-men," while surrendering; that the phrase had frozen his pursuers mid-step. No stenographer recorded the words, but they appeared in print the next day and spread nationwide, transforming a routine arrest into legend. Within weeks, G-man for government man became the public's new term for a federal agent. At the Shelby County Jail, photographers waited as the couple were led inside. The flashbulbs lit the corridor in bursts. Kelly, expression blank. Catherine, jaw set, eyes defiant. The contrast between myth and reality was stark. The man once rumored to command a band of machine gun raiders looked smaller in person, his hair damp with sweat, wrists bound behind him. The woman beside him, long considered the architect of his crimes, appeared calm, composed, her presence almost managerial. Interrogation began that afternoon. Agents from Birmingham and Oklahoma City took turns questioning the couple separately. Catherine spoke first. Her answers clipped and unemotional. She admitted nothing but confirmed acquaintances. The Shannons, Harvey Bailey, Albert Bates. She denied knowledge of the ransom or the kidnapping itself. George remained mostly silent, answering in short, cautious sentences. When confronted with the evidence, the ransom bills, the machine gun traced to Catherine's purchase, the Shannons' testimony, he lowered his eyes and said nothing further. By evening, both had signed formal transfer papers authorizing their removal to Oklahoma City for trial. On September 27th, a day after their capture, federal agents escorted the Kellys aboard a guarded train bound west. The journey took 21 hours. In each city along the route, Little Rock, Fort Smith, Tulsa, crowds gathered at the stations hoping for a glimpse of the infamous pair. The Bureau kept the blinds drawn, guards stationed at each compartment. Hoover's instructions were explicit: deliver them unharmed, and in silence. Publicity would be managed only after conviction. In Oklahoma City, preparations for their arrival were meticulous. U.S. Marshals cordoned off the federal building, installed additional locks, and positioned armed deputies along the courthouse corridor. The Bureau wanted no hint of chaos that might echo the escape of Harvey Bailey from the Dallas County Jail earlier that month. When the Kellys stepped from the train under armed escort, the street outside the courthouse erupted with flashbulbs and shouts. Agents moved them swiftly through the crowd and into custody. Inside, Hoover's representatives from Washington briefed the press with calculated restraint. The director, they explained, credited the success to cooperation among field offices and to the new investigative methods, scientific analysis, communication coordination, and interstate jurisdiction under the Lindbergh Law. While the press celebrated the triumph, the Bureau focused on logistics. Every piece of evidence seized during the investigation, the weapons, ransom bills, correspondence, and testimony, was organized into a prosecution sequence. In less than 2 weeks, the government assembled a case so comprehensive that conviction seemed inevitable. On October 10th, the trial opened in the United States District Court at Oklahoma City. The courtroom was crowded beyond capacity, reporters, spectators, and rows of uniformed agents occupying the benches. Charles Urschel, appearing calm and deliberate, took the stand. His testimony recounted the abduction, the sensory details of his confinement, and his recognition of the houses, later identified as the Shannon properties. Each fact he gave was matched with physical evidence: the tin cup, the chain, the well pulley. The prosecution presented its sequence methodically. The ransom letters, bearing the misaligned E, were displayed alongside the typewriter seized from Catherine Kelly's residence. Expert testimony confirmed the mechanical match. Bank officials traced the serial numbers of the ransom money recovered from the Shannons, Bailey, Bates, and Coleman back to the original payment. Photographs of the farmhouses, the cots, and the machine guns completed the narrative. The defense offered little beyond denial. After only a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict. On October 12, 1933, both George R. Kelly and Catherine Kelly were found guilty of kidnapping and sentenced to life imprisonment. Reporters transmitted the result across the nation before the judge's gavel struck the final blow. Outside, a crowd cheered as the couple were driven away under guard. The era of the public enemy had met its counterpoint: the era of the G-men. In Washington, Hoover used the event as a defining moment. The Bureau released official photographs of the Memphis raid, captioned simply "Arrest of Machine Gun Kelly," captured by federal agents. The phrase "Don't shoot" G-men appeared again and again in newspaper headlines. Whether the words were ever spoken no longer mattered. They served the narrative of a disciplined government, triumphing over outlaw romanticism. Public confidence in the Bureau surged, and congressional funding soon followed. Meanwhile, the aftermath unfolded quietly in Memphis. At the Tichenor house, agents completed their final inventory. They photographed the bedroom where Kelly had been arrested, the revolver on the chair, and the discarded suitcase that had contained personal papers. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk watching as the cars drove away, realizing only then the significance of the events that had taken place while they slept. For George Kelly, the long journey from Tennessee bootlegger to national outlaw had reached its conclusion in the same state where it began. For Catherine, the arrest ended years of manipulation, schemes, and control. Together they had manufactured a myth of power built on intimidation and rumor. In the end, it collapsed under the weight of evidence, routine, and federal discipline. In Oklahoma City, the evidence was sealed and archived. The Bureau's official report on the case ran to hundreds of pages, detailing each action from the Bridge Game abduction to the Dawn raid in Memphis. It documented the evolution of investigative procedure, fingerprint analysis, typewriter identification, meteorological correlation, and serial number tracing that would define federal law enforcement for decades. When the Kellys were delivered to Leavenworth Penitentiary later that year, The institution's warden recorded their arrival without ceremony. The gates closed behind them, and the noise of the outside world receded. For the Bureau, the case was finished. For the nation, it became legend. The verdict against George and Catherine Kelly echoed far beyond the courtroom. To the Bureau, it was not just a conviction, but the closing statement and a demonstration of method. Newspapers called it the government's final triumph over the machine gun era. In photographs printed nationwide, Hoover stood behind his desk, surrounded by agents. The caption reading, "Justice by scientific means." In the weeks following the October 1933 sentencing, the Bureau's offices across the country worked through an avalanche of follow-up reports. Every connected suspect, from the Shannons to Harvey Bailey, was processed through the new federal court system built under the Lindbergh kidnapping law. The files were massive: typed statements, inventory sheets, fingerprint charts, and teletype summaries that recorded the investigation step by step. Hoover insisted that each document be preserved as a training model. What had begun as an emergency response had become the template for a national criminal investigation. At Leavenworth Penitentiary, George Kelly arrived in late October. His intake record listed him as federal prisoner number 11,735, occupation self-employed, sentence life. The guards searched his belongings and found only a few clothes and letters addressed to his wife. He was placed in a cell in the middle tier and assigned to clerical work. Fellow inmates, aware of his reputation, expected a violent outlaw. What they saw instead was a soft-spoken man, polite, almost meek. The myth of Machine Gun Kelly began to fade the moment the steel door closed behind him. Catherine Kelly entered the Women's Federal Reformatory at Cincinnati, the first female prisoner sentenced under the Lindbergh Law. Her demeanor remained composed. She wrote letters to her mother, Ora Shannon, who was also serving time, and requested copies of newspapers to follow her husband's appeal. But appeals brought nothing. The evidence was too comprehensive. The public mood, too decisive. The government needed victory, and the Kelly case had provided one too visible to reverse. Back in Oklahoma City, the Bureau continued, collecting the fragments of the broader conspiracy. Harvey Bailey, already imprisoned for unrelated offenses, was transferred to federal custody. Albert Bates, captured in Denver, received life imprisonment. The Shannons were sentenced to varying terms, depending on their cooperation. One by one, every name connected to the abduction disappeared into the federal system. The crime that had stretched across half the country ended in silence, locked behind bars. For Hoover, the outcome marked the transformation of the Bureau from an obscure investigative agency into the nation's primary symbol of law enforcement. In early 1934, he ordered the Urschel files compiled into a casebook for new recruits. It outlined every procedural step: coordination between offices, evidence handling, interagency communication, and field tactics. The casebook circulated among field divisions under the title, The Model Investigation. Its success established the doctrine that would define the Bureau for decades: discipline, documentation, and centralized control. Meanwhile, Congress took notice. The Kelly case had proved the necessity of interstate enforcement authority. In 1934, a series of legislative acts expanded the Bureau's powers, authorizing agents to carry firearms, make arrests, and pursue fugitives across state lines without local warrants. It was a fundamental shift in American law enforcement. Newspapers credited Hoover personally. His image, once bureaucratic, became heroic. The director as the nation's defender against crime. The cultural impact was immediate. Magazines printed serialized accounts of the case. Radio dramas reenacted the Memphis raid with exaggerated dialogue. The phrase "don't shoot, G-men," whether ever spoken or not, became shorthand for federal victory over the criminal chaos of the Depression years. Within a year, the Bureau's recruitment rate doubled. Young men applied for positions drawn by the promise of discipline and purpose. Hoover encouraged the myth because it served the institution. By mid-1934, the Bureau was engaged in a new wave of pursuits. John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Clyde Barrow, and Bonnie Parker, and others who had defined the outlaw generation. The techniques refined during the Urschel case, interstate coordination, forensic analysis, centralized intelligence, were applied to each with increasing precision. When Dillinger was killed in Chicago that July, reporters noted that the team responsible had studied the Kelly files as a training model. Back in Leavenworth, George Kelly followed the news through smuggled newspapers. The headlines that once carried his name now featured others: newer criminals, faster and deadlier. His letters to Catherine became infrequent, shorter. Prison routine reduced him to another number among hundreds. Inmates began calling him Pop Gun Kelly, mocking the disparity between legend and reality. The same press that had made him infamous now erased him in the larger story of Hoover's rising Bureau. For the Bureau's leadership, the closure of the Kelly case provided both legitimacy and caution. Agents were instructed to treat future investigations with the same rigor. No improvisation, no reliance on intuition, and no tolerance for failure. Internal bulletins circulated quoting Hoover's directive: The Bureau's prestige rests on precision. The Kelly case must never be regarded as luck. Training manuals emphasized record-keeping, report discipline, and chain of evidence. The ethos of scientific investigation became dogma. Throughout 1934 and 1935, remnants of the ransom money continued to appear. Small clusters of $20 bills turned up in bank deposits from Oklahoma to Arkansas. Each was cataloged, cross-checked, and traced back to the same sequence of distribution that had led to Minneapolis the year before. The Bureau's accounting division eventually documented the recovery of nearly $93,000 of the $200,000 ransom. The remaining balance, presumed buried or spent, vanished into history. But to Hoover, recovery mattered less than process. The money had served its purpose. It had taught the Bureau how to follow paper trails across an expanding nation. Publicly, the Kelly case continued to define the Bureau's reputation. Hollywood began incorporating G-men into film scripts, portraying clean-cut agents, armed with evidence instead of vengeance. Hoover quietly approved of the image. It reinforced the idea of professionalism and justified increased budgets. In internal correspondence, he referred to the Urschel investigation as the cornerstone of the modern Bureau. By 1935, the organization had been formally renamed the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The timing was deliberate. The rebranding coincided with the completion of the Kelly prosecutions and the consolidation of the Bureau's new authority under federal law. From the Lindbergh case to the Kelly case, the Bureau had proven that national coordination could triumph where local law enforcement had failed. Meanwhile, life behind prison walls settled into monotony for George and Catherine. He worked as a clerk, later as a librarian. She maintained correspondence, but grew increasingly withdrawn. The once notorious pair became relics of an era that had passed. The machine gun age, the brief period when outlaws captured public fascination, was ending. What replaced it was the age of procedure, of typed reports and fingerprints, of law enforced by calculation, rather than chaos. In the archives of the Bureau's Washington headquarters, the Urschel case file occupied 3 thick volumes. The opening page listed the timeline. July 22nd, 1933, abduction in Oklahoma City. July 31st, victim released. August 12th, Shannon Ranch raid. September 26th, Kelly arrest in Memphis. October 12th, conviction and life sentence. 1934 to 1935, legislative expansion and institutional reformation. Each entry marked a transition, not just in the case, but in the identity of American law enforcement. The final memorandum, filed by Hoover himself, summarized the meaning succinctly. This case established that crime which crosses borders shall find no refuge in jurisdiction. The Bureau will act as the coordinating arm of justice for the United States. From that point onward, the Bureau's agents carried the lessons of Paradise and Memphis into every major operation. The techniques born from Urschel's sensory memory, the sound of airplanes, the pattern of rainfall, the logic of data correlation, became part of training lectures. The line between intuition and evidence, once blurred, was redrawn in ink. In Oklahoma, the Urschels returned to private life. Charles resumed his business ventures, avoiding publicity, though reporters occasionally revisited his story to illustrate the triumph of law over crime. He spoke rarely of his captivity, but continued to cooperate with the Bureau on procedural improvements for witness recall. To his employees and neighbors, he appeared unchanged, methodical, deliberate, courteous. But those who knew him best said he never again sat near an open window at night. Leavenworth Prison stood massive and still, a citadel of concrete, set against the rolling plains of Kansas. Its high walls and barred windows caught the same dry wind that moved across the wheat fields beyond. Within its rigid geometry, George Kelly served the slow sentence of time itself. Each morning began the same. The clang of the metal door, the count, the shuffle of hundreds of shoes down echoing corridors toward work details and dining halls. In this measured world of regulation, the man once called Machine Gun Kelly had become another file number, his name a footnote, within an institution that no longer recognized his legend. In the early years of his imprisonment, Kelly maintained the bearing of a man performing a role. He was polite to guards, helpful to clerks, and precise in his tasks. He worked first in the records office, copying forms and typing inmate correspondence, later in the library, where his neat handwriting and quiet discipline earned him small privileges. He read constantly, history, law, mechanical manuals, and spent evenings writing letters in a deliberate hand. The tone of those letters shifted with time. The defiance of his first months gave way to reflection, then resignation. Catherine Kelly served her sentence at the Women's Federal Reformatory in Cincinnati, later transferred to Alderson, West Virginia. The woman who had once orchestrated a criminal enterprise, with calculation and composure, adapted to prison life with the same precision she had applied to crime. She organized sewing groups, managed library inventories, and maintained correspondence with her mother, Ora Shannon, until the elder woman's death in custody. Her letters to George remained formal, absent of emotion, but meticulous in detail. Health, routine, occasional news from the outside. They were partners in history, not affection. The mid-1930s brought new arrivals to Leavenworth. Bank robbers, kidnappers, and killers swept up in the Bureau's expanding net. Among them were men whose names had filled headlines alongside Kelly's, Harvey Bailey, Albert Bates, and others from the old bootleg circuits. They recognized one another in passing, but rarely spoke. Within prison walls, fame dissolved into repetition. The public's attention had moved elsewhere, to Dillinger's death, to Babyface Nelson, to the shifting tide of federal authority. For the Bureau, the Urschel case remained its defining proof of concept. Hoover institutionalized its methods. Every new agent studied the investigation from abduction to arrest, learning how witness observation could be transformed into geographic mapping, how paper currency could become a data trail, and how coordination across states could operate with military efficiency. In classrooms inside the new FBI Academy, instructors repeated the same phrase. The Kelly case was the beginning of order. As the Bureau professionalized, Kelly's legend became myth. Newspaper retrospectives of the 1940s remembered him not as a person, but as a symbol, the archetype of the defeated outlaw. The man who coined "Don't Shoot, G-Men" became shorthand for the transition from chaos to control. Whether he had ever spoken the words no longer mattered. The myth suited the narrative of progress, and so it endured. In Leavenworth, Kelly aged quietly. His hair turned gray, his shoulders rounded, and his eyes, once sharp with calculation, grew distant. He spoke little of his past, offering only that he had been a fool for speed and money. He joined the prison's small Catholic study group, helped younger inmates with reading, and developed a reputation for calm intelligence. Guards described him as a model prisoner. The irony was complete. The man who had once terrorized his country by reputation now represented order within confinement. By 1940, Kelly was transferred briefly to the new Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary on San Francisco Bay, an administrative decision intended to separate high-profile inmates. The journey west was uneventful. He stepped from the ferry in handcuffs, squinting against the glare off the water. The island rose from the fog like a fortress of stone and steel. Inside, discipline was absolute. Each cell identical, each movement timed. The noise of the ocean replaced the open spaces of Kansas. The isolation was total. Here, no one cared for legends. For 6 years, Kelly lived under Alcatraz's routine. Up at 6, silent meals, 10-minute exercise periods in the yard, and nights listening to the wind through the narrow window slit. He read continuously, trading novels for history books through the inmate library. He rarely spoke of his crimes. Occasionally guards asked about the kidnapping, the myth, the machine gun. He answered simply that it had been overblown. Time flattened everything. In 1946, after a decade without disciplinary infractions, he was returned to Leavenworth. The Bureau approved the transfer without comment. The case no longer required symbolism. To Hoover, Kelly's continued imprisonment was enough. Justice sustained through endurance. The Bureau had moved on to Cold War counterintelligence and espionage. The age of gangsters was history. Catherine, too, faded from public view. Her parole petitions were denied repeatedly through the 1940s, her name resurfacing only in annual reports, listing inmate numbers. She maintained her composure, reading newspapers that occasionally mentioned the FBI's anniversaries and its director's growing power. Each article that celebrated Hoover's discipline carried within it the shadow of the case that had made his authority permanent. In the early 1950s, America had changed. The Depression was long over, and the crimes of the early 30s had receded into nostalgia. The FBI had become a bureaucratic monument, its laboratories and records departments symbols of modern law enforcement. The Urschel case, once the Bureau's rallying point, now occupied a few display pages in training manuals, a historical precedent rather than a living memory. Inside Leavenworth, Kelly grew frail. He spent his final years working in the prison library, cataloging books he would never read again. The guards liked him. The younger inmates sometimes sought him out for advice. He never boasted, never spoke of machine guns or outlaws. His world had contracted to the width of his cell and the rhythm of the count. On the morning of July 18, 1954, a guard making routine rounds found him lying on his bunk, still and cold. He had died in his sleep of a heart attack, aged 59. The news reached the outside world through a 2-paragraph wire story. George R. Kelly, known in the 1930s as Machine Gun Kelly, died early today at Leavenworth Penitentiary, where he was serving a life term for kidnapping. The article ran beneath the fold of a Sunday paper, next to stories about the Korean War and Senate hearings. The nation barely noticed. Catherine Kelly remained incarcerated until 1958, when she was quietly paroled after 25 years. By then she was middle-aged, her once sharp features softened by time. She lived briefly in Oklahoma, under another name, avoiding interviews and declining all requests for comment. To neighbors, she was an unremarkable woman who kept to herself and worked in a small retail store. She died in 1985, decades after her name had vanished from public memory. For the FBI, the legacy of the Kelly case endured in structure rather than sentiment. The investigation had demonstrated how data, rainfall, flight schedules, serial numbers, could become a map of human behavior. It had proven that precision could defeat panic, that bureaucracy could conquer chaos. Every major case thereafter, from espionage to organized crime, followed the same blueprint. The case was referenced in internal lectures, long after the names of the kidnappers were forgotten. The tools born of that investigation, centralized records, laboratory analysis, cross-state communication, became the foundation of the modern bureau. The same methods would one day identify spies, serial killers, and terrorists. The men who had stood in the Texas dawn of 1933 were remembered not as gunfighters, but as prototypes of a new kind of investigator. As for Charles F. Urschel, the man at the center of it all, he lived quietly in Oklahoma City until his death in 1970. He continued his business affairs and maintained a courteous relationship with the Bureau, occasionally corresponding with Hoover. He never sought fame. His recollections of those 9 days in captivity remained precise to the end. In interviews late in life, he attributed his survival to observation and memory. To those who studied the case later, those words became its essence. In the broader story of American law enforcement, the Kelly case marked a turning point, a moment when criminal myth yielded to institutional order. The image of a barefoot oilman counting airplanes in the dark became the origin myth of modern investigation. Observation turned into evidence. Evidence into pursuit, pursuit into justice. From that foundation, Hoover built his empire. Decades later, when historians reconstructed the era of the Depression outlaws, they found in the Urschel case something quieter than the gunfire of the bank robbers. A lesson in calculation. The kidnapping had begun as a crime of opportunity and ended as a national demonstration of discipline. Between those points lay the transformation of the United States into a country that believed crime could be solved not by chance or confession, but by method. The fields around Paradise, Texas, where Urschel had once been chained, long ago returned to farmland. The Shannons' houses decayed, their wells filled with silt. Only faint depressions in the soil marked where the boardwalks had been. Few who lived nearby remembered what had happened there. Yet the map coordinates remained in the Bureau's archives, preserved in ink and paper. On the original file's cover, typed in 1933, and still legible decades later, were the words, "Case of Charles F. Urschel. Investigation and arrest of George and Catherine Kelly." That document, copied and refiled across generations, stood as the true monument to the era, the quiet paper record that outlived every headline.